What does a civilization sound like when it chooses at last to listen to the cosmos? In a century defined by its own inventions, humanity arrived at a strange and luminous summit. It was not a single moment so much as the convergence of many artificial intelligences that could tease meaning from chaos, quantum machines that bent probability to compute what classical logic could not, and fleets of telescopes and satellites arranged like a nervous system around a planet. Together, they formed a new kind of sense, an engineered perception that extended the human mind into the dark between the stars. The apex of human technology was not simply power or speed. It was the patient, recursive refinement of instruments and ideas until the noise of the universe could be held aside like a curtain. Telescopes became storytellers. Satellites became scouts. Networks of detectors linked optical, radio, infrared, gravitational, and particle windows into a single, continuous scan. The result was a world that no longer waited for chance alignments. It actively queried the sky, probing every shadow, listening for patterns that might be deliberate. In the first layer of this architecture were the eyes, an array of observatories scattered from equatorial deserts to polar plateaus, from sea platforms that bobbed beneath auroral skies to space-borne behemoths in halo orbits. Each instrument had its own biography of engineering, mirror segments polished to nanometer tolerances, cryogenic chambers that kept detectors at temperatures approaching absolute zero, coronagraphs that could blot a star into artificial night so a dim planet might be seen. The observatories worked in concert, not as isolated sentries, but as parts of a choreography of sight. When one caught a glint, another pivoted to confirm. When a field shifted, others swept through complementary wavelengths. An optical flash might be checked for radio echoes, or thermal signatures, or neutrino bursts. No cue was trusted alone. Above them, satellite constellations performed a mechanical ballet. Thousands of small platforms orbited in tight phasings, their trajectories arranged to synthesize apertures the size of continents. Solar sails, tethered interferometers, and deep space relays synchronized with the patience of geologic time. Thrusters fired in tiny puffs the size of a fingernail's motion. Reaction wheels whispered adjustments. Antennae unfurled like cosmic ears. Each satellite carried specialized sensors tuned to a single band of the spectrum, but their collective output was a richness that no single instrument could achieve. The sweep of their scans was relentless and methodical. Day and night, there were places in the sky that had never been looked at so thoroughly. Hidden beneath the visible operations of hardware was a different kind of engine, algorithms that changed the nature of evidence. Machine learning models evolved beyond pattern recognition into creative hypothesis formation. They were trained on simulated universes and ancient physics, on cataloged star behavior, and the messy signatures of human technology. These models did not merely flag anomalies, they proposed generative explanations, ran counterfactuals, and suggested where to look next. When data arrived, it flowed into a cascade of inference. Initial filters crushed the obvious, secondary networks reconstructed signals from shards. Tertiary systems proposed narratives for the emergent structures. Parallel to this, quantum computation provided a way to invert problems that the classical mind had always found intractable. Questions like, which source produced this correlated modulation across dissimilar wavelengths? Or, what source geometry could produce this set of phase-shifted echoes, became solvable by harnessing superposition and entanglement. Quantum samplers explored immense spaces of possible configurations in milliseconds. They produced probability distributions, not single answers but landscapes of plausibility. Machine learning read those landscapes like a map, finding ridges and paths to the most telling follow-ups. In combination, AI and quantum machines acted like a sculptor and a chisel, one imagining forms, the other carving through uncertainty. The human aspect of the summit was 1,000 small dramas folded into collective attention. There was an atmosphere of ecstatic terror in conference centers and control rooms, a quiet mania in the comment threads of global streams. The public reacted as publics always do, with memes and marches, with philosophical treatises and late-night punditry, but the core work remained slow, obsessively methodical. Teams of specialists, engineers, astrophysicists, data scientists, ethicists, calibrated instruments according to ritualized protocols. Nights were spent aligning mirrors and updating ephemerides. Weeks were consumed by rerunning inference chains when a subtle bias was found in training data. Months passed in the administration of access protocols and in the negotiations over who could point a sensitive instrument and when. There were small, almost ceremonial moments that belied the clinical descriptions. In an observatory high on a mountain, the last technician closed a hatch and checked an optical bench for dust with gloved hands, her breath fogging in the cold. A control center's monitors glowed green as a wavefront sensor reported stability within a fraction of a wavelength. In orbital control suites, engineers read the telemetry from a newly deployed interferometer like a ship's log. Drift within acceptable bounds, phase locks achieved, cryocoolers humming. Those tiny acts, the lowering of a hatch, the confirmation beep, the exchange of a terse status line, were the human scaffolding around an immense automated intelligence. They were the slow, fragile rituals that kept the machines honest. This summit of sensors and minds created a new kind of patience. Data arrived in torrents, but the work of decipherment rarely rewarded impatience. The systems learned to listen as a musician listens, not only to the sharp staccato of events, but to the subtlest timbres. They measured cross-correlations that spanned years. They stacked signals across time, folding epochs together to amplify whispers into audible shapes. Through computational folding and epoch averaging, the faintest coherences garnered significance. What once required centuries of observation could now be inferred by stacking years of high-fidelity data and letting probability unmask recurring motifs. The result was an unexpected intimacy with the fabric of the cosmos. What had previously been a sky of anonymous light became a palimpsest of histories. The echoes of supernovae, the slow dimming of fading galaxies, the technical signatures of human spacecraft passing like fireflies. In this new sensory era, the very idea of an unknown shifted. Unknowns were no longer simply hidden, they were defined by the limits of interpretation. A modulation observed across disparate bands might be natural, a product of dusty plasma and magnetic fields. Or it might be intentional. The tools now made that distinction less metaphysical and more empirical, and the more empirical it became, the more unsettling the margins around certainty. With capability came a kind of ethical vertigo. The more thoroughly humans could observe, the more consequences there were to knowledge. To identify a signal as artificial carried democratic, political, and existential weight. Every alert issued to the public had to pass not only statistical significance, but ethical review. There were protocols for public disclosure, for moderating alarm speculation, for preparing societies for shifts in worldview. The possibility that a detection could destabilize markets, governments, or faiths was not theoretical, it was a planning parameter. This made the process slower, more deliberative, and yet it made secrecy harder to maintain. The global information infrastructure was porous, and leaks were themselves a source of political theater. Amid these tensions, the instruments sometimes behaved like artists, producing patterns that seemed to flirt with meaning. A particular wide-field survey, designed originally to map the diffuse infrared background, began to produce a curious modulation across its detectors. The signal was weak and draped across the sky, a quasi-periodic pattern whose amplitude varied with wavelength in a way that suggested neither simple thermal sources nor known plasma processes. Initial runs of the classical deconvolution pipelines reduced it to a statistically insignificant blip. Yet that was precisely when the AI quantum system's value revealed itself, by approaching the data not as a single correct answer, but as a space of plausible generative histories. The machine ensembles proposed configurations that human intuition had not prioritized. One hypothesis modeled the pattern as a dispersed series of phase-locked emitters spanning interstellar distances. Another suggested a pattern created by large-scale scattering geometry in a circumstellar medium. Each model assigned different predictive follow-ups: where to point a radio array, what spectral line to search for, which polarization signature would most discriminate among the possibilities. When the network recommended reorienting a network of narrowband radio telescopes to the same swath, those telescopes obeyed within hours. Arrays phased up, baselines stretched, and correlators began to chew through petabytes. There is a peculiar sensory memory that comes with watching such an operation, the way screens in a control room tile with matrices of numbers that, to human eyes, look like a city seen from above. The hum of cooling fans, the low staccato beeps of job queues, the soft blue backlight that outlines the faces of those watching. These are the human textures that surround a deeply non-human process. The data streams were relentless. As they were ingested, the algorithms refined priors, reweighted assumptions, and proposed new observational geometries. Each iteration pruned hypotheses like a gardener cutting away deadwood, revealing branches that might bear fruit. In the margins of this technical ballet was the psychological geography of expectation. The world had learned to expect the unexpected, and yet expectation itself had a weight. Politicians drafted contingency plans for cultural shocks. Religious leaders convened councils to interpret the possible meanings of contact. Philosophers wrote essays about the ethics of initiating or refusing communication. The art world produced uneasy work that imagined both benevolent and indifferent intelligences. Cooks and baristas joked in 1,000 small ways, turning the cosmos into a meme. The public oscillated between boredom and breathless attention like a tide responding to the moon. What set this era apart, however, was the change in the epistemic threshold. Previously, claims of extraterrestrial signals had required implausible confidence because the background of human-made pollution was so high. Now, with the summit of instruments and the computational overlay, the question was not just, is it real? But what does it most likely imply? Because the systems could model multi-band coherence, temporal regularity, and spatial distribution, they translated ambiguity into a ranked set of narratives. Some of these narratives were mundane, others were unsettling, but the practical effect was the same. The world could no longer treat potential cosmic messages as curiosities. They became potential evidence for rewriting a chapter of human self-understanding. At the very moment when humanity learned to hear more accurately, it also learned the discipline of listening. Detection was not an exclamation point, but a sentence that demanded completion, follow-ups, confirmations, cross-disciplinary dialogues, and an ethical framework for disclosure. The apex was therefore both an enabling technology and a governance challenge. It transformed the intimate questions of philosophy into the public business of policy and engineering. And yet, amid the careful calibrations and ethical debates, there remained, almost against protocol, a sense of wonder that resisted discipline. Even in the most clinical of rooms, when a visualizer rendered a weak but consistent modulation into a waveform that suggested structure, the atmosphere shifted. People did not shout, there was no sudden jubilation. Instead, there was that small, involuntary human response, a quieting, as if someone had asked a properly timed question into a grand and listening silence. That silence was the hinge of the story. Technology had, finally, done what humans had always dreamed it might do: peel back a layer of the universe and reveal a pattern that history alone could not have recorded. But the pattern was still ambiguous, and ambiguity is where stories begin. To call it an alien secret before the work of interpretation was complete would be to leap beyond the very epistemic modesty that had brought the world to the summit in the first place. So the instruments kept their vigil. Telescopes reframed their fields, satellites adjusted their sweeps. Quantum circuits resampled probability landscapes. The collective intelligence held its breath in a way that no individual could. It listened, measured, modeled, and waited for the pattern to resolve into a narrative that could be shared without plunging the world into chaos. The apex of technology did not culminate in a single revelation. It produced a method, a way of asking the right questions and of refusing to settle too quickly for comforting answers. In the hush that followed the first hint, the faint modulation that threaded across detectors like a syllable in an unfamiliar language, there was both terror and tenderness. The terror came from the realization that understanding could cascade into consequences nobody could fully anticipate. The tenderness was a collective response to the smallness of the planet beneath all that telescopic gaze, and to the fragile instrumentality that now extended humanity's senses outward. Deep time had rendered civilizations ephemeral. Now, for the first time, technology offered a way to bridge eras, to recover signals that might have outlived their senders, or to meet minds that had been waiting across the dark. The apex had been reached, not as an endpoint, but as a threshold. At that threshold, the machines began to do what they had always been built to do: to turn observation into comprehension. And the comprehension, once achieved, would write a new chapter, not only in the annals of science, but in the story humanity told itself. The question was no longer whether the cosmos held secrets. It was whether humanity, having reached the summit of its own making, would have the wisdom to read them. What does the subsurface of a world sound like when it decides, in its slow and indifferent way, to make a pattern that does not fit anything known? The question arrived not as a headline, but as a wrinkle in a data stream, a narrow-band modulation buried beneath 1,000 other motions, a repetition that refused to be dismissed. It began in a place the instruments had been taught to ignore, a fringe of continental crust where human presence was sparse and the geology was stubbornly old. There was no bright flash, no sudden spike. Instead, there was a regularity that threaded through months of routine recordings like a melody heard beneath a thunderstorm. The frequency did not match the catalogs of earthquakes, tectonic tremor, volcanic harmonics, or industrial noise. It occupied a small, clean sliver of the spectrum that sat between the well-charted territories of mechanical vibration and electromagnetic hiss, an island of coherence that, under the right kind of scrutiny, suggested deliberate structure. The discovery began in the same way many modern revelations begin these days, as a statistical oddity surfaced by an ensemble of machines. Arrays of seismometers, originally deployed to map deep crustal structure and to monitor for induced seismicity from human activity, had been integrated into the global sensory mesh that the summit of instruments now maintained. Their raw traces fed secondary networks that cross-correlated mechanical signals with electromagnetic and magnetic observations. That redundancy, the engineers like to say, was how one turned coincidence into evidence. These systems were designed to flag the unexpected with ruthless consistency. When they did, it meant the world had supplied them something their priors did not anticipate. At first, the anomaly was a whisper that the filters reduced rather than amplified. A few nodes in a remote seismic net showed a narrow spectral peak that persisted at a nearly uniform phase relationship across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. The amplitude was minuscule, orders of magnitude below the background rumble, but the phase coherence was unnatural for typical seismic waves traveling through heterogeneous crust. When the classical pipelines attempted to interpolate source location and depth using standard velocity models, the results either failed to converge or produced physically implausible depths. The source, in computational terms, lived in the margins of the model space. The machine learning overlays, trained on countless simulations of tectonic and anthropogenic processes, paused and then suggested a different tack. Expand the model to include coupled electromechanical sources, phenomena where mechanical strain manifests as persistent telluric currents and field perturbations. That suggestion itself was a pivot. Electromechanical coupling in rocks is not unknown. Piezoelectricity and electrokinetic effects are real and sometimes measurable. But what the sensors implied was a modulation that paired mechanical oscillation with a correlated magnetic signature and an electromagnetic phase that suggested internal coherence, not mere opportunistic conversion. The frequency band was clean enough to invite harmonics and modulation analysis. When the analysts ran envelope and Hilbert transforms, the signal resolved into a complex rhythm, a fundamental carrier with overtones and a low-rate amplitude modulation that repeated with a quasi-stable period. It was the kind of structure that, in other contexts, would be flagged as engineered. The reaction across disciplines was immediate and quiet. It is one thing to see a number that looks odd on a screen, and quite another to watch an entire analytic ecosystem refactor itself around an anomaly. Geophysicists dug into the crustal models, adjusting velocity anisotropies and considering previously neglected scattering regimes. Magnetotelluric specialists reprocessed induction vectors, looking for telltale polarities that might indicate a localized current system. Radial observatories swept the overhead sky to rule out anthropogenic transmitters, or ionospheric reflections masquerading as downwards propagating signals. Archive datasets were interrogated for decades. Old echoes. The anomaly persisted, subtle and patient, in records that predated the installation of the modern mesh. It was not brand new. It had been whispering through layers of instrumentation for years, invisible until the summit of sensors learned to listen for such things. There is a characteristic tone to those first long nights of collective attention. Control rooms, already accustomed to nocturnal vigilance, took on the mood of a watch kept over a sleeping city. Monitors tiled with spectrograms, correlation matrices, and phase delay maps. Algorithms iterated through hypotheses, ranking and discarding possibilities with a speed that made human reasoning feel leisurely. Yet the human element remained crucial, deciding which priors to trust, which models to favor, and how much of the signal could be confidently decontaminated from known noise. Ethical officers prepared disclosure thresholds. Archivists searched for legal constraints on data sharing. Remote communities nearest the affected area were contacted with the careful protocols developed in previous years for potentially disruptive findings. The world had learned, painfully, that curiosity needed to be balanced with caution. As checks accumulated, the anomaly proved stubbornly consistent. It did not conform to diurnal patterns or to obvious seasonal variations. It displayed a subtle modulation aligned with the fortnightly tidal cycle, not a simple correlation, but a nuanced entrainment that suggested something within the Earth responding preferentially when tidal stresses reached certain phases. That coincidence widened the interpretive space. Was this a physical resonance triggered by stress cycles? A mechanical structure amplified by changing fluid pressures in deep aquifers? Or, more speculatively, a signal deliberately timed to exploit the mechanical breathing of a planet? Speculation moved fast in the shadow of such data, and speculation is both necessary and dangerous. The analysts resisted the temptation to leap to narratives. Instead, they layered possibilities. Natural resonant cavities carved by ancient fluids, slow oscillations of a deep, brittle, ductile transition, anthropogenic installations long abandoned, even the far-reaching tail of previously undetected volcanic tremor. Each hypothesis came with testable predictions. A fluid resonant cavity would respond differently to pressure perturbations. A brittle failure mechanism would produce high-frequency transients. An electromechanical structure would leave distinct magnetic fingerprints. The machine learning ensembles proposed observational experiments, deploy borehole sensors to increase signal-to-noise ratio at depth, install co-located magnetometers and electric field sensors to capture coupled phenomena, and apply synchronized active sources to probe the medium's transfer function. The field mobilization that followed was a choreography of logistics made urgent. A fleet of autonomous data mules, ground vehicles, and subterranean drones carried lightweight seismometers and electric field electrodes into difficult terrain. Deep boreholes were instrumented where permitted by geology and regulation, and fiber optic distributed acoustic sensing systems were extended to provide dense linear arrays. Each deployment was a needle into the planet, bristling with the potential for discovery and for damage. The science managers had to balance the appetite for data against the potential environmental cost and the rights of local stakeholders. Consent, stewardship, and scientific curiosity had to be reconciled in real time, an ethical calculus that was now as important as any inversion algorithm. As denser data arrived, the anomaly's portrait sharpened. The signal's spectral purity increased with proximity to certain geological formations. Crystalline basement rocks and zones with high quartz content seemed to favor the modulation. In borehole records, the phase stability improved, and the overtones resolved into ratios that hinted at resonant geometries, standing wave-like patterns that implied a bounded cavity or a periodic array of discontinuities. Cross-spectral analysis between mechanical and magnetic channels showed a consistent phase lag, a small delay between strain and field perturbation that matched laboratory measurements of electrokinetic transduction in saturated fractures. In essence, the Earth was doing what rocks could do, converting mechanical motion into electrical effects. But the regularity and the harmonic structure remained atypical. This is the moment where human narrative pressure is strongest. The mind wants to name agency, to place a cause in a comprehensible category. But the documentary stance demands patience, to present the unfolding without premature closure. So the teams cataloged what was known and what remained mysterious. Known, a spectrally narrow, persistent modulation with coherent phase across hundreds of kilometers, reproduced in archival records, and enhanced near certain lithologies. Unresolved, the mechanism producing the remarkably regular harmonic series and the reason, if any, for the apparent synchronization with tidal cycles. Ancillary questions proliferated. Was this a natural amplifier that the planet had not shown before because modern instrumentation was required to see it? Or was it evidence of something else? A structure or system embedded in deep time, now revealed by the sensitivity of 21st century perception? Deep time always lurks in such conversations. The planet is old enough to host processes that produce regularity on timescales beyond human experience. Glacial rebound, sediment compaction, and metamorphic fabric formation can create quasi-periodic structures when driven by long-term stress fields. But there was another strain of thought that could not be entirely dismissed, that of historical agency erased by erosion, weather, or time. If a patterned structure existed in the subsurface, a lattice of voids, a preserved network of ancient construction, or a legacy of pre-industrial engineering, it would be faint, and the Earth's processes would have been the world's most effective scrubbers. It was a possibility so fragile and so loaded with implication that it had to remain a hypothesis to be interrogated, not a conclusion to be announced. Public reaction, when the basic facts leaked into broader channels, was immediate and multifaceted. For some, the idea that the planet could make a purposeful sounding pattern touched on the numinous. For others, it felt like a technical curiosity with no ontological weight. Newsrooms recycled old scripts about hidden civilizations, while scientific communicators emphasized the long process of validation and the humility of uncertainty. The scientists themselves adopted a practiced calm, repeatedly returning to the same refrain: collect more data, run more controlled experiments, and let the Earth's responses, not human imagination, dictate the narrative. There were nights, however, when the technical sobriety gave way to a quieter emotion. In the control rooms, after the formal meetings and the obligatory briefings, operators found themselves watching spectrograms as if they were stargazers watching the sky. The signal's repeating envelope had a rhythm that the mind could almost find solace in. A small, mathematical heartbeat that made the planet feel less like an inert mass and more like a slow, articulate presence. That feeling was not evidence. It was a human response to pattern. Yet it carried its own truth. That perception changes the perceiver. The more the instruments revealed, the more the world reshaped its expectations about what a planet could express. As experiments proceeded, the analytic machinery returned to work with renewed rigor. Active seismic sources were timed to coincide with tidal phases, magnetotelluric arrays were reoriented, deep electrical soundings were performed. The models refined their priors and eliminated entire classes of natural noise. The signal endured through these tests, and in some cases it became clearer. The standing wave ratios stubbornly suggested bounded geometries, and the electromechanical coupling constants matched those measured in saturated quartz-rich fracture networks, but scaled in a way that required either a vast natural cavity with fortuitous geometry or an engineered set of resonators. That scaling problem is where the story held its breath. The planet, after all, permits both astonishing natural coincidences and freakish structures carved by chance. Science had instruments now to measure with an intimacy that would have been miraculous a century before. Yet measurement alone does not translate to meaning. The team's posture became one of cautious curiosity, to assume nothing beyond what the data demanded, to design targeted experiments, and to remain honest about the limits of inference. This discipline was the product of a hard-won epistemic humility, a recognition that in the long tale of deep time, certainty is often an illusion. In the end, the anomaly in the data did what all good anomalies do. It reframed questions. It forced disciplines to talk across boundaries, to test the seams of their models, and to invent new instruments for listening. It reminded observers of an old fact, recalled more often in poetry than in lab reports, that the Earth is not merely a backdrop, but an actor with its own temporalities. Whether the modulation arose from natural resonance, from long-buried human handiwork, or from processes not yet imagined, the practical consequence was the same. Humanity had been given a new reason to listen downward as well as outward, to pair telescopes with boreholes, to treat the subsurface with the same curiosity and responsibility previously reserved for the sky. And in that widened vigilance lay a modest ethical lesson: to observe is to be changed by what is observed. The signal, once a statistical oddity, had become a mirror held up to perception itself. It asked not for immediate answers, but for sustained attention, for a style of inquiry that could hold paradox and patience in equal measure. The Earth had offered a voice, faint and ambiguous, and the summit of instruments responded by learning a new kind of listening, one that measured not only amplitude and phase, but the moral weight of knowledge. What if the ground beneath a continent kept one of its stories in a language no living person could read? The image arrived like a whisper amplified, a narrow slice of transmitted data from a subterranean drone that had been asked the simplest of tasks: to map, in ever finer detail, an anomaly first sketched by remote sensing. For months, the continent's skin had yielded strange harmonics and phase-stable tremors. The mesh of seismometers and magnetotelluric arrays had suggested a peculiarly resonant geometry. Now, an autonomous instrument, designed to go where cores could not and eyes could not see, had threaded its way into a fracture network and returned a set of frames whose pattern would not dissolve into geology. Those frames showed metal. They were not the casual accident of mineralization metals that a geologist might expect: metallic sulfides, films of pyrite glinting in veinlets. They were surfaces, planar and punctuated with regular perforations, seams that betrayed joins, and a repeating modularity that, when rendered into three-dimensional reconstructions, resolved into a lattice-like volume nested within the rock. Light from the drone's illumination played off a patina that was both corroded and strangely coherent. Concentric layers of oxidation, interleaved with mineral incrustation, as if the metal had been sleeping under pressure for epochs and had acquired a skin of the earth itself. The immediate technical response was disciplined and procedural. The drone's raw telemetry, inertial records, sonar and LiDAR returns, multispectral optical frames, electromagnetic induction readings, and chemical sniffers were fed into the summit's analytic pipelines. Algorithms stitched frames into meshes, tested for stitching artifacts, and cross-validated with independent datasets. Muon tomography that had been running above the site, long baseline GPR transects recorded months earlier, and borehole logs from exploratory wells drilled decades prior. Where the different modalities intersected, the picture remained: a coherent structure occupying a pocket deep beneath the continental crust, its geometry not easily explained by known natural processes. There is a particular quality to that first hour of convergence, the moment when disparate instruments sing the same note. Control rooms, which for weeks had been humming with hypothesis and protocol, fell into a kind of suspended attention. teams that specialized in seismology, materials science, planetary geophysics, and remote sensing accumulated around tiled displays. They did not claim a narrative, they cataloged anomalies and framed tests. In the theater of the summit, the collective voice was one of precise curiosity rather than alarm. But beneath that professional calm was another register of feeling, a tightness of breath, as if the planet had offered up a relic from a deeper archive. Dating became the question that could not be deferred. Metal, as a material, complicates time. It does not hold organic markers for radiocarbon. It corrodes and recrystallizes. It may be reworked or transported. The team therefore pursued stratigraphic anchors, the sediments directly overlying the structure, the mineral cements that formed against its surfaces, and the microfossils preserved in adjacent horizons. Optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, on quartz grains trapped against the metallic surfaces could tell when those grains last saw sunlight. Uranium series and radiogenic profiles in overgrowths could provide age brackets for carbonate cements. Where organic detritus existed, charcoal, peat lenses, or preserved plant remains within sealed pockets. Radiocarbon offered short windows. And, when possible, cosmogenic nuclide dating of exposed elements above the site would constrain exposure history at broader scales. The first batch of results arrived like slow news from deep time. Multiple independent assays clustered in the tens of thousands of years. Luminescence ages of sediments in direct contact with the structure coalesced around values between 30 and 50,000 years. Some carbonate overgrowths yielded uranium series ages within overlapping ranges. Organic fragments found in sealed pockets registered radiocarbon ages pushing toward the limits of the method's calibration, consistent with ancient, not recent, association. The uncertainties were real and acknowledged. Bayesian modeling was applied to reconcile stratigraphy with absolute dates, and conservative priors were favored. Even with caution baked into the analyses, the picture refused to be young. That numerical horizon transformed the problem. A metal structure, intimate with the planet and apparently embedded tens of thousands of years ago, did not sit easily within existing narratives about human technology. The archaeological record of metallurgy, of complex, sustained craft, did not feature widespread metal latticework from that span in the regions concerned. If the structure was anthropogenic, it implied either a lost chapter in human material culture or a technology born outside known human lineages. If it was not human, then the Earth had preserved a fabrication that challenged assumptions about agency and makers. The analytical work multiplied. Materials scientists prepared microscopic cross-sections of corroded flakes, using focused ion beam techniques to avoid contamination and to preserve the context of corrosion layers. Electron backscatter diffraction revealed crystallographic textures in corrosion products that carried signatures of slow transformation under pressure and chemical exchange with mineral-rich fluids. Trace element analyses and isotopic ratios were painstakingly measured. Some alloys displayed compositions dominated by iron and nickel, but in proportions and microstructures inconsistent with both natural ferromagnesian nodules and with the known metallurgy of early humans. Grain boundaries suggested controlled cooling histories and deformation patterns that spoke of fabrication, not of accidental formation. One of the most disquieting observations was isotopic. Certain non-radiogenic isotopic anomalies in the metallic matrix did not match terrestrial baseline distributions for elements like chromium and tungsten. They were subtle within analytical error, but consistent across samples. Those anomalies opened speculative corridors: fractionation during high-temperature processing, provenance from unusual ore deposits, or signatures of manufacture using feedstocks processed under conditions not typical of the Holocene. The data did not demand a single story. They demanded caution and new curiosity. The fieldwork that followed was equally ritualized and fraught. Drilling rigs appeared, not as the blunt instruments of industrial extraction, but as surgical tools. Diamond coring devices with clean room protocols, sterile liners, and pressure-maintaining systems to prevent alteration of samples on recovery. Each core was described, photographed, and cataloged with metadata that read like the minutes of a museum: depth, orientation, ambient conditions, adjacent lithologies, and a chain of custody to preserve provenance. Remote handling suites processed the cores under inert atmospheres. Microsamples were reserved for destructive analyses and non-destructive imaging. Micro-CT scans and neutron tomography provided three-dimensional internal vistas without touching the object. Ethics and jurisdiction came to the fore with an intensity commensurate to the discovery's implication. The subsurface did not belong solely to scientific curiosity. It sat within territories of living communities and sovereign lands. The protocols honored these claims, consultations were held, moratoria considered, and stewardship prioritized. The siege of modernity. The reflex to extract, display, and monetize was tempered by an emergent ethic. The ruin beneath the rock had a social context that could not be erased by the allure of revelation. International bodies that governed heritage, rare materials, and scientific exchange were convened. Questions surfaced about ownership, conservation, and the right to interpretation. The instruments had found something. People had to decide how to respond. Public reaction, unsurprisingly, ran ahead of the data. Social feeds brimmed with metaphors, lost cities, pre-ice age civilizations, or planetary memory encoded in metal. News cycles demanded narratives. Scientists, in turn, issued measured communiques that emphasized uncertainty and the slow arithmetic of proof. The atmosphere outside the labs was a mixture of speculation, wonder, skepticism, and anxiety. Policymakers parsed pathways of disclosure. Publishers raced to contextualize the discovery against histories of lost knowledge and the humility of deep time. Within the scientific community, hypotheses proliferated but were disciplined by method. Natural formation processes were re-examined with renewed rigor. Could certain geochemical precipitates, under unique conditions of pressure, fluid chemistry, and tectonic quiescence, coalesce into metallic lattices? Could percolating hydrothermal fluids produce layered metallic films that later delaminated into regular arrays? Theoretical models were tested. Experimental petrology added constraints. Instances of self-assembly in mineral systems were cataloged and compared against the observations. None replicated the geometry with fidelity. Conversely, scenarios invoking human or pre-human agency were mapped against the archaeological record. Were there toolkits, cultural patterns, or dispersal routes that could plausibly correlate? The absence of corroborating artifacts in nearby strata weighed against straightforward claims of lost civilizations. There was another, more unsettling class of possibility. The structure's modularity and metallic composition invited the question of non-human manufacture. Structures emplaced by organisms or systems that did not fit the human timeline. Biological processes can concentrate metals. Think of microbial biomineralization, but not typically into ordered lattices of the scale observed. A last resort hypothesis considered some kind of external origin, material delivered by spacefall, altered and annealed in situ into an apparently constructed form. The data rarely cleanly supported any of these endpoints. The appropriate posture, repeated like a mantra in meetings and public statements, was humility. Present what the instruments said, admit what they could not. One of the deeper tensions in the laboratory's daily rhythm was the emotional landscape. The scientists and technicians who handled cores and hovered over spectrometers were, by training and temperament, stoic. Yet the work left room for wonder and for ethical unease. In the quiet of late shifts, operators found themselves reading spec graphs as if they were hieroglyphs, imagining the hands, intentional or otherwise, that might have once worked that metal. That imagination was not evidence, it was human response. It shaped the questions asked and the paths selected for testing, and it reminded the community that interpretation is a human act as much as it is a technical one. The discovery also transformed the summit's sensory priorities. Until then, the project had been asymmetric. Outward-looking telescopes paired with inward-looking seismometers. Now the inward listening demanded a new kind of instrument, non-invasive scanners that could map molecular films on metal beneath meters of rock, autonomous cavitation drones that could take microsamples without disturbing context, and analytical suites that could reconcile isotopic puzzles at parts per trillion levels. Funding streams reoriented. Cross-disciplinary teams matured from acquaintances into working collectives. The planet had, in a single find, reframed the agenda for exploration. What remained constant across weeks and months of work was epistemic patience. The data assembled itself into constraints, but not into a final story. The presence of metal deep in the crust, dated by a confluence of methods to tens of thousands of years, constituted a fact that demanded respectful interrogation. It did not, by itself, resolve the origin, function, or implications of the structure. That ambiguity was, paradoxically, the feature that sustained attention. The ruin was not a cinematic revelation, it was an invitation, a problem posed to science about the continuity of material culture, the habits of the planet, and the limits of memory. At the edge of the technical reports and policy briefs, the human narrative persisted, a mixture of awe and responsibility. The ruin, cloaked in corroded metal and mineral incrustation, eroded the comfortable notion that the past was neatly archived in novels, monuments, and museums. Deep time, it reminded observers, is indifferent to narratives but generous in leaving traces, if instruments were willing to read them. The summit of instruments had learned a new lesson: to listen, with humility and with protocol, to the storied silence beneath their feet. The drone that had first shown a glint of unnatural geometry remained a symbol of this new posture. It had not spoken in words, it had only returned images, numbers, and an arrangement of pixels that refused to be explained away. But those returns were sufficient to alter the arc of curiosity. The forgotten ruins, once an abstract possibility whispered among speculative lines of code, had become an object of responsible inquiry. The work ahead, careful excavation of meaning not merely of material, would be long, multidisciplinary, and ethically charged. The planet, patient and vast, had spoken in a register that spanned epochs. Humanity's reply would have to be measured in time scales and in ethics appropriate to the voice in the rock. What does history look like when machines begin to listen, not only for singular artifacts, but for the recurring grammar that threads cultures together? It began, in the literal sense, as a question posed to an ensemble of algorithms. When every surviving image, plan, and astronomical observation from thousands of archaeological sites was treated as a dataset, what patterns would emerge that human eyes had missed? The question was simple. The implication was not. At the summit of instruments that had learned to turn whispers into hypotheses, telescopes that had teased cosmic modulations, and probes that had excavated metallic lattices from the crust, a different kind of gaze turned inward toward the archive of human traces. The same appetite for pattern that had been applied to the sky and the subterranean now surveyed pottery shards, temple foundations, star charts, and petroglyphs. The aim was not to find the sensational, but to map recurrence, motifs that repeated across geography and time with a statistical stubbornness that asked for explanation. The architecture of the analysis was itself a story. Massive repositories of three-dimensional scans, multispectral photographs, museum catalogs, and field notes were integrated into a unified corpus. Convolutional neural networks, trained on millions of labeled features, column capitals, spiral motifs, roof plans, and star line orientations, learned to abstract form into vectors. Unsupervised clustering algorithms then took those vectors and asked, what groups naturally form without human preconception? Graph theoretical tools traced connections, motifs that co-occurred within structures, sequences of symbols that persisted across inscriptions, spatial motifs of settlement planning that defied local topography. Temporal layers were folded in with Bayesian chronological models, radiocarbon probability distributions, and stratigraphic constraints, turning objects into points in a four-dimensional lattice of form and time. What surfaced was neither a single loud signal nor a tidy proof. It was a family of recurring motifs, architectural modules, emblematic marks, and consistent astronomical alignments, appearing in contexts separated by thousands of kilometers and millennia. Pillared enclosures with a peculiar tripartite plan reappeared in coastal settlements and inland sanctuaries. A graphic sign, a paired crescent and dot, turned up carved into megalithic slabs, stamped onto ceramic linings, and painted on cratered rock faces across different continents. Alignments of long-axis plans with particular azimuths correlated with stellar risings at epochs that predated the cultural phases in which the buildings were historically situated. The recurrence was not random, it had structure, it had a rhythm. The machine's assigned probabilities were intuition bulked. A triadic planform that might once have been dismissed as regionally idiosyncratic now showed up with a frequency that exceeded chance by orders of magnitude when normalized for site preservation and sampling bias. The paired crescent dot sign held a recurrent positional grammar. When inverted, it appeared at entrances. When repeated 3 times, it appeared at high-altitude shrines. The alignment data, adjusted for precessional motion of the heavens and for local horizon profiles, clustered around a narrow set of declinations, angles in which specific stars rose above certain horizons at roughly periodic intervals across multiple cultural chronologies. As the patterns accumulated, human responses followed a familiar choreography: skeptical pruning, rigorous hypothesis testing, and cautious public communication. Archaeologists re-examined typologies and classification histories. Ethnoastronomers re-ran stellar precession models and simulated horizon events for epochs separated by tens of thousands of years. Material scientists revisited pigment analyses and tool marks, seeking manufacturing unity that might point to shared technology or exchange. At each stage, the team resisted the dramatic leap: lost civilization, secret inheritance, insisting instead on the hard alternatives. Diffusion, independent invention constrained by shared environmental and material affordances, and the cognitive universals that make certain forms likely across minds. Yet the loops of evidence pushed the conversation into uneasy territories. Some motifs appeared in places where direct contact was highly improbable given current models of human mobility for the relevant periods. Some architectural modules required precise engineering solutions improbably similar across distant regions. The astronomical alignments, when plotted against the long processional sweep of the sky, suggested not only intentional orientation, but an awareness of celestial motion on timescales longer than a single generation. That implied either extremely long-lived traditions, the deliberate preservation of astronomical knowledge across erosive centuries, or a transmission mechanism that outlived political and demographic collapses. The analytic apparatus did not stop at correlation. Generative models were run to probe mechanism, could shared constraints, similar materials, identical functional needs, or convergent aesthetic reasoning account for the recurrence? Synthetic data experiments were designed. The AI would recreate hypothetical cultural lineages under different assumptions of contact, mobility, and environmental constraints, and then measure whether motifs like the triadic plan would emerge spontaneously. These controlled simulations revealed that while some motifs could indeed arise independently under similar selective pressures, the particular combination observed, planform, iconography, and stellar alignment as a package, was statistically unlikely without some form of information transfer or a common ancestral prototype. That statistical claim did not equal proof. It offered only a narrow window through which further investigation could proceed. The next steps became both analytical and ethical, to seek material links that could corroborate the inferred connections, and to do so in a way that respected living communities, local sovereignty, and the possibility of creating more harm than understanding. The field response was an orchestra of remote sensing and targeted excavation bound by restraint. Ground-penetrating radar surveys were layered across suspected corridors of transmission. Portable spectrometers reanalyzed decorative palettes for rare pigments that might hint at trade. Isotopic sourcing of metals and stones was prioritized to test whether similar raw material networks underpinned distant similarities. When available, ancient DNA and proteomic residues from domestic assemblages were interrogated for lineage overlaps. Each positive linkage, a shared pigment source, a metal alloy with a unique smelting signature, increased the probability of cultural contact. Yet the absence of such linkages did not abolish the pattern, it merely complicated its plausible explanations. Throughout this process, the human institutions involved tried to keep a steady voice. Museums and research centers convened panels that mixed methods, archaeometry, ethnography, computational linguistics, and philosophy of history. They framed provisional findings as hypotheses. Recurrent packages of form, symbol, and orientation existed with non-trivial frequency across the global dataset. Multiple lines of independent evidence suggested that some of these recurrences could not be fully explained by convergent evolution alone. These pronouncements were careful, but the world outside the labs, readers of feeds, viewers of documentary-style summaries, communities with inheritable claims on the past, heard something else. The idea that history might conceal a chapter of shared knowledge, a set of practices woven through deep time, touched a nerve. It opened the door to wonder and to the anxieties that accompany any suggestion of erased memory. There were practical debates as well. If a model suggested long-distance cultural links stretching deeper than the current archaeological consensus allowed, it would require rethinking migration models, climatic constraints, and the durability of oral and material traditions. It would invite new surveys in poorly sampled regions, but those surveys could be extractive if not handled with care. The ethical committees that had emerged since earlier high-stakes finds insisted on community partnerships, capacity building, and transparent data sharing. The newly vocal public, curious, politicized, sometimes conspiratorial, demanded narratives and certainties that the methods could not supply. In the quiet corridors of the data centers, an effective counterpoint unfolded. Technicians who had spent nights training networks and pruning false positives found themselves watching arrays of motifs across a wall of screens. There was a human response that the analytical language could not contain, a sense of encountering an ancestral chorus, voices layered like palimpsests across ages. That was not evidence. It was the psychological echo of pattern recognition amplified by story. It pushed teams to ask better questions, but it also risked biasing interpretation. The narrative discipline insisted on a firewall, allow wonder to motivate investigation, but let method guard against premature myth-making. One of the more consequential outcomes of the machine-driven analysis was a revival of comparative frameworks. Symbolic sequences that had been cataloged regionally were now read as variants of broader syntax. Architects and anthropologists revisited the notion that form can carry mnemonic function. A plan repeated across hilltops might be a storage of a cosmological argument, an encoded calendar, or a standardized measure that facilitated exchange. Astronomical orientations, once cataloged as ritual expressions tied to local cosmologies, were considered as potential carriers of information across generations, not merely ceremonial but preservative. The idea was less that these forms constituted a written language, and more that they constituted a performance of memory, a durable grammar that could survive the erosion of names and polities. The machines, for their part, proposed additional experiments. They suggested targeted chronometric sampling to refine temporal overlap probabilities, urged the deployment of non-invasive imaging to preserve context, and recommended building synthetic corpora that could help distinguish intentional replication from convergent simplification. They also surfaced a cautionary statistical artifact. Cultural data are not neutral counts. Preservation biases, selective collecting, and colonial-era sampling strategies had skewed the record. Any claim of recurrence needed to be corrected for those distortions if it was to be credible. The public discourse refracted the issue into many languages. Some narratives framed the recurrence as evidence of an erased, widely spread civilization, an attractive hypothesis because it grants symmetry to scattered fragments. Others cautioned against grand stories. Humans have always borrowed ideas, and similar problems produce similar solutions. Some voices, anchored in living traditions, saw in recurring forms an echo of ancestral knowledge worth protecting against appropriation. The resulting debate was messy but necessary. It forced institutions to be explicit about uncertainty, to foreground consent in any research plan, and to distribute authority over interpretation more broadly than the Academy had traditionally done. Through it all, the documentary posture did not rush to a verdict. The patterns were real, their implication was not yet. The machines had provided an axis of inquiry that humanists and scientists could orbit, an empirical map of recurrence that called for multidisciplinary exploration. The moment held a particular philosophical weight. Deep time tends to erase actors and to preserve outcomes in forms opaque to the untrained eye. When an analytical summit mines across epochs and geographies, it is not merely reconstructing causal chains, it is negotiating the moral architecture of the past. Who gets to speak for it, and how should we translate a grammar that may have belonged to people whose voices are otherwise gone? The narrative ended, or rather paused, at a hinge. The AI had found patterns that stitched disparate chapters of human material history into a mosaic more coherent than previously thought. That coherence did not yet justify claiming a lost civilization in the dramatic sense. Instead, it proposed a set of more modest, more demanding questions. How durable are mnemonic forms? How do techniques, motifs, and celestial knowledge traverse generations of collapse and reconstitution? What responsibilities do modern investigators carry when their instruments can reconstruct echoes where time has erased names? As the teams prepared the next phase, targeted fieldwork designed with local stewardship at its center, refined chronological sampling, and public engagement that privileged context over sensationalism. There was a renewed sense of ethical humility. The machines had done what they were built to do, extract structure from complexity. The humans now had to do what they had promised themselves in earlier nights at the summit, to answer with patience, with respect, and with the kind of moral attention that deep time deserves. The patterns in history had been found. Interpreting them without annexing the rights of the living or the dignity of the dead was the task ahead. In that way, the discovery became less a revelation of a single lost chapter and more an invitation to a different posture toward the past, one that combines technological acuity with care, curiosity with consent, and statistical claim with cultural humility. The planet had yielded a pattern. The work of making sense of it, responsibly and slowly, was only beginning. What if the archives themselves began to speak back, not in the blunt, heroic voice of a headline, but in the tiny, patient cadences of marginalia, film grain, and the faint echo of analog tape? What if documents that had been sealed behind classification stamps for decades suddenly revealed threads that looped across the sky, the crust, and the human record? Threads that suggested a single, stubborn influence threaded through events separated by geography and time. The declassification came not as a single act, but as a slow unspooling. Files released under Freedom of Information statutes, packages leaked by retired clerks, scanned microfilm surfacing in obscure catalogs. Each item by itself was modest. A radar trace from a Cold War patrol, a field report from an airbase technician, a plate from an early infrared camera, a carbon copy of a memorandum. Taken together, and when read against the new sensitivities of 21st century instruments, the papers began to change shape. Patterns that had previously been dismissed as coincidence or human error acquired a new statistical weight. The summit of instruments, which had been trained to fold epics of data into composite probability landscapes, was well suited to listen for such faint harmonies. When old analog traces were digitized and fed into modern analysis pipelines, anomalies emerged that had been invisible to the eyes that first recorded them. The documents themselves were hybrid artifacts: the crisp, typewritten memo with its stamped classification markings, the brittle photographic negatives with halos of silver, a reel-to-reel audio spool whose hiss carried the imprint of another technology's limitations. There were Air Force logs that recorded radar returns described in cold technical language as unidentified and maneuvering against prevailing winds. There were hospital records cataloging unusual burns and transient neurological symptoms among radar technicians who had been exposed to persistent interference. There were minutes of meetings in which officers deliberated whether to brief political leadership. There were, too, the photographs, grainy exposures of luminous disks or elongated shapes caught at odd angles, some blurred by motion, others unnervingly sharp, their outlines hinting at geometry rather than accident. What changed the tenor of these artifacts was not merely their existence, but the overlay of context. The summit's archival reanalysis treated each record as a signal that could be co-registered with other measurements across decades. Radar tracks from the 1950s, once cataloged as fleeting blips, were reprocessed with modern signal reconstruction, revealing modulations in amplitude and phase that matched a narrowband harmonic found in contemporary sky surveys. Audio tapes, thought to contain only a throbbing hiss, betrayed a subcarrier, a low-rate amplitude modulation that, when demodulated and converted to spectrograms, showed the same multi-harmonic signature that had been detected in the planet's subsurface tremor. Photographic plates, examined with hyperspectral reconstructions, revealed coatings and thermal gradients consistent with materials whose corrosion products matched samples taken from the buried lattice discovered beneath the continental crust. The convergence was statistical, not cinematic. It did not spell out a tidy narrative of intention or origin. Instead, it offered probabilistic overlap, the same narrow spectral bands cropping up in radar returns, in electromagnetic interference recorded near mid-century test ranges, and in modern astronomical surveys, iconographic echoes. A crescent dot motif appearing in witness sketches from the 1940s and in petroglyph-like marks catalogued in disparate archaeological collections, and a recurrent triadic architectural grammar that, when plotted against unclassified aerial surveys, aligned with sites that had recorded anomalous electromagnetic events decades before. The relationship was not singularly causal. It was a lattice of cross-validated correlations that pointed to a common influence capable of inscribing itself across media and across epochs. Technically, the reconstruction was delicate. Century-old recordings demanded careful digitization to avoid introducing artifacts that could masquerade as signal. Machine learning models were trained not only to detect structure, but to estimate the confidence one should have in those detections given the provenance of the data. Cross-domain inference, correlating radar traces with subterranean magnetometer readings or with archaeological motif distributions, required the fusion of disparate uncertainty models. The summit's algorithms, honed on the task of teasing meaning from cosmic noise, treated the archives like another spectral window. Where human analysts feared pattonic lust, the temptation to see faces in static, the models supplied probabilistic thresholds that restrained dramatic claims without stifling inquiry. Still, the very act of aligning Cold War-era traces with 21st century signals felt like a kind of time-symmetric listening. Instruments trained in the present, bending their sensitivity backward to honor the faint voices of an analog past. The human institutions that had once managed secrecy reacted in predictable and unpredictable ways. Government agencies, accustomed to triaging risk and reputation, faced a dilemma that classification alone had not prepared them for. Where secrecy had once been rationalized as necessary for security, to prevent panic, to avoid strategic destabilization, the increasing weight of cross-era evidence punctured that calculus. The leak landscape was messy. Some disclosures were accidental, decades-old folders improperly archived, their indexes misaligned, an elderly archivist's set of slides found in an attic and donated to a small museum that posted scans online. Other releases were deliberate, strategic acts by actors who believed that public scrutiny should supersede institutional control. The result was a fragmented public record, partial, edited, often redacted, that nonetheless carried echoes of a larger coherence. Public reaction to the declassified trove moved through familiar phases. Early scoops produced a glut of sensational headlines. Social feeds replayed photos out of context. Pundits and commentators constructed narratives that ranged from the conspiratorial to the metaphysical. but the summit's careful, methodical reanalysis reframed the conversation from spectacle to question. Rather than asking simply, "What is this?" the discourse shifted toward, "What does a persistence of signature across media and time imply?" The question reframed the phenomenon as an influence, not necessarily an agent in the human sense, but a persistent perturbation that could imprint itself across instruments, materials, and human memory. The emotional undertow of this discovery was complex. Institutions experienced bureaucratic vertigo. Legal counsel argued over the duty to inform, historical offices worried about the integrity of the record, and museum curators bristled at the ethical stakes of displaying material tied to living communities and contested sovereignties. Among the public, there was a mixture of wonder and unease. For some, the archival echoes suggested a narrated past in which human beings had brushed against forces or artifacts that altered their trajectory. For others, the files were confirmation of long-held suspicions about concealment and manipulation. The tenor overall was not triumphalist. It was disquieting and reverent at once, a recognition that human institutions had long mediated and sometimes muffled traces of wider realities. In the corridors of science, a different register of feeling prevailed, disciplined curiosity laced with moral caution. Researchers whose work depended upon trust, archaeologists, historians, geophysicists, emphasized the need for rigorous provenance, for community consent in any excavation or display, and for an epistemology that resisted the pull of narrative over data. The summit's approach, cross-validation, replication, and conservative inference, was adopted as an ethical stance as much as a methodological one. The files provided leads, nothing more. They were an invitation to sustained, collaborative inquiry rather than a fulcrum for instant verdicts. One of the most revealing contents of the declassified trove was a series of redacted intelligence summaries produced in the mid-20th century. The language in these summaries betrayed the bureaucratic habit of flattening nuance into posture. Phrases like unidentified aerial phenomena and anomalous electromagnetic signatures sat beside recommendations for classified monitoring programs and inclement assessments about societal impact. The documents make clear that those in power had noticed patterns but had lacked the tools, analytic, technological, or juridical, to interpret them beyond immediate operational concerns. They had cataloged, monitored, and sometimes misattributed. In places, the records hinted at nascent recognition that the same pattern of interference had been recorded on a test-range radar, on a naval sonar track, and in the logs of an observatory's early infrared plates. Those hints, once digitized and reprojected into modern analysis frameworks, pushed the needle from curiosity toward coherence. Another class of artifacts that gained new significance under reanalysis was the body of eyewitness sketches and civil reports. When treated as raw semiotic data, rather than proof of a sensational claim, these reports contributed to a statistical morphology, common angles of approach, recurring shapes, and repeated symbology that paralleled motifs recovered in archaeological corpora. Seen against the backdrop of the summit's computational archaeology, the coronation of a single motif across rock art, aerial sketches, and mid-century witness drawings became less a conspiratorial sign and more an empirical clue. It suggested a mimetic persistence, a form or set of forms that had persisted in the human record, perhaps as habit, perhaps as adoption, perhaps as response to the same external stimulus. The files also exposed an ethical architecture that had to be rebuilt. The revelation that governments had, for decades, buffered citizens from certain streams of knowledge, whether out of prudence or vanity, meant that remediation was required. Archives needed to be opened with context, not just dumped online. Communities whose land and heritage intersected with the material in the documents needed to be engaged as stakeholders, not as passive subjects of discovery. The summit's response was procedural as well as moral. Standards for digitization, chains of custody, transparent metadata, and community-led interpretive frameworks were proposed as safeguards against the twin dangers of extraction and sensationalism. Most consequentially, the declassified files did not produce a clean origin story. They did, however, accumulate an argument that disparate phenomena, atmospheric anomalies observed in mid-century radar, electromagnetic interference recorded near ancient ritual sites, subterranean resonant patterns, metallic lattices entombed in crustal pockets, recurring symbolic grammars across archaeological shards, could reasonably be read as different manifestations of a single, persistent influence. The influence did not announce itself as an actor in the human sense. It revealed itself as a topology of effect, a set of recurring imprints across medium and epoch. To say common source was, at this stage, to posit a provisional heuristic rather than an ontological claim. It was a way of organizing evidence so that investigation could move forward with discipline, to look for mechanisms that could produce multi-domain signatures over long time spans and across physical regimes. The moral of the archive's new voice was modest and unsettling at once. Small human devices, tape reels, radar tubes, typewriters, had recorded traces of something that outlived governments and outlived the individuals who once annotated margins in exhausted biro. That survivability, whose traceability had just been extended by digital methods, reframes time as a medium in which influence could persist without easy attribution. The summit's task, then, was not only technical detection but ethical stewardship, to listen without erasure, to interpret without appropriation, and to build narratives that respected both the fragility of human communities and the long patience of planetary processes. In the end, the release and reanalysis of declassified files produced a convergent effect on collective imagination. They did not offer the comfort of a single explanatory poster. Instead, they thickened the outline of a problem. Across sky and crust, across museum cabinets and magnetic tapes, there was now a coherent constellation of anomalies whose combined contours suggested a common source of influence, something that left its mark on instruments, on material culture, and on human perception. The discovery demanded humility. It required a mode of inquiry attentive to timescales longer than any single polity and to forms of agency that might not correspond to human categories. The old secrecy had sheltered the unknown. The new openness exposed the work ahead, careful listening, patient analysis, and an ethic that treats the past's whisper not as a prize to be claimed, but as a voice that must be answered with responsibility. What would it mean, the narrator asked, for the planet to hand back an inscription older than the memory of its ice? The question arrived with an instrument's certainty and a field team's exhausted caution. Buried beneath 2 million years of Antarctic ice, a thickness of white so patient it had folded continents into maps of silence, a slab of stone was recovered. At first glance it seemed ordinary in the way that extraordinary things often do. A flake of lithic matter, heavier than expected, matte where frost had ground its face, rimed with mineral accretions that made it look as if the rock wore the continent's skin. Etched across one face were characters that refused immediate translation. They were neither the ornamental scratches of wind-polished striations, nor the natural fracturing lines that glaciologists taught their students to read. The marks were deliberate, regular, repeated with a cadence that invited comparison to script rather than to fracture. The first public descriptions were necessarily clinical, coordinates, depth beneath basal ice, the primary imaging modalities used. But behind the sterile facts there was a slow, collective inwardness, the particular hush of professionals confronting something that blurred the boundaries between fieldwork and portent. Protocols unfurled like liturgy. Clean suits, sterile drills, and layered containment replaced the tactile thrill of discovery. The slab would not be brushed into a museum case and displayed with a brass plaque. It would instead be read as data, scanned, modeled, sterilized, and interrogated in a dozen parallel ways intended to keep human contamination from wrecking whatever story might be locked in mineral and microstructure. Three-dimensional scanning was the first to speak back. High-resolution photogrammetry and structured light scanning rendered the surface into a mosaic of meshes and normals, revealing grooves and incision depths with a resolution that made every tool mark legible. But the more surprising intelligence lay beneath the exterior. Ground-penetrating radar profiles, muon tomography runs, and portable neutron imaging, layered and cross-validated, revealed a cavity or inclusion in the slab, not a void, but a volume of layered material distinctly different from the host rock. Micro-CT reconstruction showed an internal morphology that suggested thin, membranous layers, folded and laminated, trapped within a calcitic matrix. Whatever lay there had been sealed by time and pressure, preserved within the cold vault of the continent like an organ in a museum's deepest freezer. The careful choreography that followed read like a checklist written for moments of impossible significance. The slab was photographed in situ, then transferred into a cold chain containment system. Remote manipulator arms, operating inside a nitrogen-purged enclosure, excised a small, calculated section of the inclusion for non-destructive interrogation. Neutron imaging produced contrast between hydrogen-rich films and inorganic mineral laminae. Raman spectroscopy, infrared attenuation, and mass spectrometric runs teased out organic signatures, patterns of carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur in ratios that were familiar yet not conforming to expected templates. The initial impression was startlingly simple and destabilizing. The inclusion contained complex organic matter, organized at scales that suggested structure and pattern rather than random deposition. Genetic protocols were invoked as if drawing the world into conversation. Nucleic acid extraction, carried out with extreme precautions against modern contamination, produced reproducible sequences of base-like polymers. Bioinformatic pipelines, those same engines that had triaged billions of environmental samples in the era of metagenomics, began to align reads against every cataloged genome the world had ever compiled. Bacteria, archaea, eukaryotes, viruses, even synthetic constructs from laboratory archives. The alignments failed to fit. If genetics was a language, the sequences from the slab spoke dialects no catalog held. Codon usage statistics diverged from terrestrial norms. Phylogenetic placement algorithms, the scaffolding that normally knots unknown sequences to known branches, returned nothing tidy. Patterns emerged instead, repeated motifs, internal symmetries, and an alphabet that favored statistical relationships unlike the ribonucleic choreography of earthly life. To say the material was alien would have been to claim more than the evidence allowed. What could be said, with both scientific rigor and an awareness of rhetorical gravity, was this: the genetic-like polymers recovered from the slab did not belong to any lineage recorded on Earth. They formed a lattice of information and chemistry that was coherent but not homologous to terrestrial genomes. The lab reports registered this distinction not as a sensational headline but as probabilistic inference, a quantitative mismatch between expectation and observation. That mismatch, however, was large enough to force the world's attention. Reaction unfolded along familiar institutional lines. Scientific committees convened on hastened schedules. Ethical overseers and legal counsel mapped jurisdictional constraints. Antarctica's governance under international treaty. The rights of research stations. The claims and voices of indigenous peoples whose histories and cosmologies intersected, often painlessly and sometimes contentiously, with narratives of the deep past. Containment protocols governed who could see what and how data would be shared. The democratic impulse to publish clashed with a scientific imperative to verify. For a while, the story lived in the liminal space of preprints, guarded metadata, and closed-door briefings. Yet in closed rooms and in long weekend email threads, there was a human undertow. Wonder mingled with dread, exhilaration married to responsibility. Emotion, in these contexts, does not attach itself to individuals in the way a novel might ask. Instead, it coats institutions and communities. Lab teams adopted a collective posture of cautious reverence. The global scientific community experienced a form of anticipatory grief and elation. Grief because a discovery of such scale prickles questions that cannot be hurried, and elation because the instruments had finally, after decades of patient refinement, exposed a voice that the planet had kept secret. Ethicists argued, not in metaphors but with policy texts, about consent, about whether samples should be sequenced at all, about whether making a public archive of the sequences would be an act of liberation or an invitation to exploitation. Meanwhile, historians of science reflected on how the field's own narratives would have to expand. The boundary between extraterrestrial hypothesis and emergent terrestrial anomaly had thinned. More than the genetics, the slab returned another jolt, iconography that linked across the project's earlier discoveries. The carved characters on the stone's face echoed a motif. The computational archaeology teams had cataloged as the recurring crescent and dot, a sign that had been found in the comparative corpus of petroglyphs and on pottery shards across otherwise disconnected locales. The same triadic architectural grammar, too, seemed faintly mirrored in the slab's relief work. Patterns that the algorithms earlier suggested might represent durable mnemonic forms reappeared here, as if the slab were a concentrated node in a network the data had only begun to map. Even archival traces, a radar plate from mid-century declassified records, and a grainy eyewitness sketch contained lines and interpolations that, when overlaid with the slab's forms, resonated rather than matched. The effect was not proof of a single actor, but an enrichment of a hypothesis. Some persistent influence had left traces in stone, in field reports, in deep strata, and now in a preserved organic inclusion. The possibility that the inclusion's biochemistry and the slab's iconography were related to a common origin forced a careful taxonomy of causes. Naturalistic explanations were tested first, as a matter of method and humility. Could non-biological polymers produced by long-term chemical processing in rare geochemical conditions produce sequences that merely looked lifelike? Could contamination, ancient or recent, be responsible? Rigorous controls, negative controls, and replicates were invoked. Laboratories exchanged blind samples. Independent teams using different sequencing platforms reproduced the anomalous patterns. Geological contexts. The nature of the overlying ice, the stratigraphy above and below the find horizon, the mineral cements adhering to the slab, were reanalyzed to search for diagenetic processes that might explain both the organics and the engraving. Those lines of inquiry reduced but did not remove the anomaly. Parallel to the technical verification, conversations with broader publics were choreographed with an ethic that had matured since earlier episodes of Disclosure. Messages emphasize uncertainty, the need for replication, and the rights of communities with cultural and historical stakes. Critics accused the process of deliberate, slow walking. Others accused it of alarmist secrecy. The debate about transparency, about narrative control, about who gets to interpret histories embedded in ice became a parallel story to the science itself. In those debates, the artifact took on meaning beyond its chemical signature. It was a mirror reflecting society's anxieties about origins, stewardship, and the human habit of imposing narrative onto fragmentary evidence. The scientific work itself widened. Materials scientists began to probe the metallurgy of the engraving technique. Abrasion patterns suggested tools that left microstriae inconsistent with typical flake retouch, pointing instead to implements that oscillated on frequency bands now familiar to engineers studying engineered resonances in the deep crust. Isotopic analyses of the mineral overgrowths offered age brackets that, while imprecise, confirmed the inclusion had been sealed long before humans built enduring monuments in the surrounding regions. Cryostratigraphers mapped the slab's emplacement, considering whether it had been transported subglacially or was a remnant of a landscape that became buried as ice advanced. Each domain contributed constraints and possibilities, narrowing the corridor of plausible histories without forcing an improbable conclusion. Philosophically, the discovery nudged a deeper discomfort. If an organic information system, chemically coherent yet alien to Earth's phylogenies, had been sealed within a carved stone and buried under 2 million years of ice, then two classes of questions emerged. One concerned mechanism. How could such polymers arise and be preserved, and what processes could create the combination of inscription and inclusion? The other concerned agency. Did the slab represent a purposeful deposit by a maker, or was it an accidental accretion of foreign matter into a carved surface? The first demanded technical rigor, the second demanded interpretive caution. Both demanded humility before time. The artifact also reframed the earlier lattice of evidence. The subterranean resonances, the metallic lattice buried within the crust, the recurring motifs in material culture, and the archival echoes now had a new node to which connections could plausibly be drawn. The narrative that had been convenient, that the planet had offered a set of disconnected anomalies, was no longer a safe story. Correlation matrices were updated, probabilistic models were reweighted, but nowhere in the numerical reanalysis did certainty emerge. Instead, the contours of the inquiry thickened. Here was an object that begged a long, multidisciplinary answer, rather than a headline or a tidy theory. At the edge of the work, policy questions took on a moral gravity. The slab resided under the Antarctic Treaty System's protections, yet its implications reached global publics. Should the sequences be made public? Could human handling of the inclusion pose biosafety risks, not just from potential pathogenicity, but from the unknown ecological consequences of exposing modern microbiomes to ancient chemistries? Who would steward the artifact? The answers were not technical alone. They would require negotiation among nations, scientific consortia, and the living communities whose histories could be implicated. In the quieter moments, the scientists and scholars involved returned privately to a simple, resonant thought. The planet had produced an object that resisted neat classification. That resistance was not a failure of method, but an invitation to a new posture, patient, plural, and ethically grounded. The discovery did not declare a finished story, it offered instead a frame for further listening. Instruments had done what instruments do best. They had extended perception into registers humans could not by themselves access. Now, with the slab's inclusion reading like a language whose syntax the world had not yet learned, the imperative was not to rush to an answer but to cultivate the forms of inquiry that could hold paradox and time in equal measure. The first artifact, immersed for epochs beneath ice that remembers oceans and continents as if they were phases of a longer narrative, had spoken. It had not shouted. It left questions like footprints, deliberate marks that suggested intent, internal, biologically patterned matter that suggested a lineage not of Earth, and a web of correspondences that drew together disparate threads the summit had been gathering for years. How humanity would answer, with openness, with care, with humility before the scale of deep time, was not only a scientific problem. It was an ethical one, and it would shape what the planet meant to those who stood on it and who now, for the first time in such an intimate way, were being asked to listen. What does a message become when it is not written in words, but in the choreography of matter itself? A small, ordered pattern that, once read, unfurls into a story of a star, a planet, and a species trying to become legible to the dark? The answer arrived not as an audible proclamation, but as a spatial revelation, a three-dimensional visual field that emerged when a recurring symbol, first catalogued across petroglyphs, archival sketches, and the corroded lattice pulled from the crust, was finally decoded. The symbol had been a knot in the data, a crescent paired with a point, repeated like a breathing motif across epochs and media. For years, it was an annoyance and a curiosity, an imprint whose statistical recurrence across archaeological corpora and declassified records suggested an influence that preferred certain shapes. Only when an interdisciplinary protocol treated the symbol as a physical operator, a nanoscale instruction set encoded in metallurgical microstructures and in the phase relationships of archived electromagnetic traces, did the shape reveal itself as a key? Decoding began as an engineering problem and became a ritual of patient listening. Algorithms treated the motif not as a static mark, but as a resonant pattern, a lattice of encoded phase delays and amplitude modulations dispersed across scales. The metallic lattices recovered from deep fractures, when examined with transmission electron microscopy and nanoscale tomography, revealed regular voids and metallographic features that were more akin to etched circuitry than to natural mineral growth. Under different excitations, these arrays behaved like diffraction gratings and phased apertures. The archival radar traces, when reprocessed with modern deconvolution and time reversal techniques, revealed a consistent narrowband carrier with sidebands whose phase envelopes matched the spatial phase gradients recorded in the metal. It was as if the symbol had been written in several dialects at once, in stone, in metal grain, in electromagnetic time, waiting for a listener that could speak across those dialects. The apparatus that finally read the message was itself an assemblage of the project's best and strangest instruments. A lattice of nanoelectronic probes, designed originally to sample the metallic relic without destructive extraction, was repurposed as a phased array. Driven by quantum-enhanced inversion routines, the array induced controlled excitations within the metallurgical microstructure. These excitations were minute, fluctuations in electron density and lattice phonons at scales 1,000 times smaller than a human hair, but the lattice answered coherently. The device did not so much transmit information as nudge the structure into revealing the way it had been organized. When the induced oscillations were captured and transformed, the outputs were no longer simple spectra. They were three-dimensional phase fields that, when rendered by volumetric synthesis, behaved like images redeeming themselves from noise. What filled the rendering volume was a long, slow narration in light. It began with the geometry of a star system, an orange-white sun circled by a compact arrangement of planets. Orbits traced themselves like patient calligraphy. The inner planet bore the deep blue-green swirl that had been known to telescopes for centuries. The projection did not read like a textbook. It read like an inventory drawn by a mind trained to notice signatures, orbital resonances, axial tilts, the subtle asymmetries of planetary albedo. The system was familiar, unremarkable to those who had catalogued millions of exoplanets, but the rendering then zoomed with a tenderness that passed through telescope resolution and reached planetary scale until continents, cloud systems, and coastlines emerged in a slow unfolding. It was at this scale that the true strange beauty of the image became evident. The sequence did not simply show geography, it showed change. Oceans receded and advanced, ice sheets crept like glaciers of time. Vegetation patterns shifted and then shifted again. The projection compressed epochs into a visual parable. Chemical clouds thickened, novel pigments appeared on coastlines, and at certain moments the planet's surface momentarily glowed with point-like constellations that expanded and contracted in patterns clear enough to be read as technological signatures. Cities, from that vantage, were luminous topographies, clustered points of reflected light, linear networks of bright filaments crossing landscapes, satellites like constellated beads in the near space around the planet. Perhaps the most disorienting aspect of the visual record was its point of view. The camera, if camera was even the right metaphor, was not anthropocentric. It watched as an external observer might, with a mixture of cataloging detachment and archival patience. The narrative voice of the imagery was not the drama of human biography, but the disciplined attention of an archivist. It marked the emergence of tool use, the spread of populations, and the rise of energy signatures with the same clinical patience with which it recorded orbital mechanics. Moments that human histories treat as epochal. The first urban cores, the first trans-global transmissions, flashed on the screen with no explanatory voice. There were no captions, no moralizing annotations, only the fact of occurrence. Lights turned on, networks grew, atmospheric chemistry changed. Interleaved with planetary images were close-up sequences that had an unsettling intimacy. They portrayed anatomical diagrams of the intelligent species most active on the planet. Morphological outlines, gestural schematics, hints of developmental stages. These were not portraits. They were functional renditions, limbs, cranial forms, tools in hand, drawn as if the observer wished to index form rather than aesthetic. The array progressed through an evolutionary arc. Early primate foragers, the slow proliferation of hominins, the explosion of symbolic artifacts, the domestication of fire and the construction of shelter, the gradual accretion of technological layers. In the projection, each innovation was rendered as an emissive event, a change in the landscape of energy use and structural complexity that could be traced across time. What made the sequence particularly provocative was the juxtaposition of intimacy and distance. The observer charted the species' material culture, structures, metallurgy, and eventually satellites and orbital artifacts, not in triumphalist narrative but as markers of traceability. The message's author did not celebrate, it annotated. There were moments that looked like tests of attention, a close-up of a triangular architectural module, a skin marking that matched the crescent and dot motif. These motifs reappeared as if the observer used them as keys for continuity, small anchors for reading across millennia. The slab recovered from the ice, the metallic lattice in the crust, and the carved petroglyphs were not isolated artifacts in the observer's view, they were nodes in a distributed record system. Interpretation of intent is where human frameworks begin to strain. The projection could be read in multiple compatible ways. It might be an archive, an impartial catalog created by a watchful presence intended as a durable record of a planetary project. It might be a monitoring log, the telemetry of a long-running sensor array designed to watch the rise and fall of activity on the planet. Or, perhaps most unnerving, it might be an act of curation, an entity's choice to preserve and to make legible certain moments, to select a species for its informational value rather than to address it directly. The message contained no spoken warning, no command, and no direct call to contact. It offered, instead, what historians call data and what poets call a mirror, a replay of human emergence seen through the patient eye of an outsider. The projection's silence was an argument. It implied a scale of time and intention that did not hinge on immediate interaction. The observer's purposes, whatever they were, spanned epochs. The archive's care suggested an ethic of record-keeping rather than interference. The immediate human response to the rendering was complex and layered. Across scientific centers and public fora, the image's appearance reframed debates that had been simmering for years. For some, the message confirmed hypotheses. The planet had been observed, cataloged, and recorded by influences that left subtle imprints in material and electromagnetic archives. For others, the image provoked acute discomfort. To be so plainly the subject of an external gaze collapsed notions of human autonomy into an archival objectivity. Religions and philosophies found new hermeneutic challenges. Political actors calibrated statements with care, mindful that any rhetoric could ripple across markets and alliances in unpredictable ways. The technological community experienced a different pang, a cognitive adjustment. Instruments that had been built to read the sky and the ground now faced the realization that their data had been co-opted into a larger record-keeping topology. The summit of sensors, for long taught to reduce ambiguity into rank-ordered hypotheses, had to accommodate a new category. Cultural artifacts, encoded at the level of phase and grain, produced with a technological sophistication that belonged to a different modality of engineering. Methods had to be extended, new units of analysis. Nanoscale signifiers, cross-modal correspondences became scientific necessities. The ethical implications were immediate. Who, now, had the right to interpret such a message? The projection itself bore no ownership. It seemed intentionally neutral with respect to political boundaries, but its discovery and stewardship fell into the hands of global institutions, national authorities, and local communities whose histories intersected with the sites where traces had been found. Questions proliferated. Should the projection be made public in full? Should the raw face fields be archived in an open repository or held under curated supervision until their implications could be responsibly contextualized? How would disclosure affect fragile communities whose ancestral narratives might be reinterpreted through the lens of an external archivist's gaze? The policies that had been developed for earlier sensitive finds, Moratoria on excavation, community consultations, inclusive stewardship were suddenly urgent. Perhaps the most unsettling implication was philosophical. The message reframed the relationship between observer and observed. It implied that the Earth had been, for reasons not yet clear, considered worth chronicling across time. That alone forced a reassessment of human centrality. Rather than being the solitary narrators of their own story, humans became participants in someone else's record. The adaptation that followed had to be ethical as much as scientific. The discovery urged restraint, the recognition that reading is a responsibility and that responding, if response was even permissible, required humility. Yet the message also carried a gentler mandate. In showing the long arc of change, from simple life to complex societies, from local fires to planetary scale emissions, the projection functioned as a mirror for stewardship. It made visible the material consequences of choices, tracing energy signatures, atmospheric perturbations, and ecological shifts with a dispassionate clarity that doubled as a moral prompt. Whether intended as admonition or not, the visual record demanded reflection on the fragility of cultural continuity, on the ethics of leaving traces, and on the obligations inherent in being a species capable of altering planetary systems. The decoding of the symbol and the emergence of the three-dimensional archive refocused research agendas. New collaborations were chartered between materials, science, and cosmology, between ethnoarchaeology and information theory. Instruments were redesigned to be both less intrusive and more sensitive to phase-encoded archives. Governance frameworks were drafted that prioritized community voice and international cooperation over unilateral action. The emphasis shifted from the sensational to the procedural, how to build institutions capable of responsibly interpreting and caring for records that might have been placed on a planetary scale for reasons strangers to human imagination. In the quiet that followed the public viewings, there was a prevailing human emotion, a mixture of awe and humility. The message had not solved riddles so much as reorient questions. It had preserved a planet's story as an observer might preserve a specimen, and in doing so, it asked for an ethical reply. To listen, the projection suggested, was already an adoption of responsibility. The archive did not demand immediate answers. It demanded attention, patience, and the deliberate cultivation of methods and morals commensurate with timescales longer than human institutions had previously contemplated. The investigators' instruments had finally learned a new grammar, to read nanoscale inscriptions as narratives, to fold electromagnetic memory into visual archives, and to treat symbols not as isolated marks but as operators that unlock complex syntheses. What remained, and what the message quietly insisted upon, was the necessity of restraint. The planet's story, as recorded by another, was no command, it was an opportunity. It offered a mirror through which humanity could see its trajectory with a clarity that both humbled and empowered. Responding wisely would mean embracing humility, building transnational stewardship, and committing to the slow, difficult work of listening that the long narrative of a planet requires. What if the most unsettling hypothesis was also the simplest, that humanity was not only watched, recorded, and catalogued, but that it had been, in some measure, shaped, nudged across epochs by an intelligence whose instruments spanned stars, rock, and memory? The thought arrives like a small, persistent vibration in a machine room, not a shout, but a sequence of harmonics that reorganizes the ways questions are asked. It reframes the artifacts already uncovered. The latticed metal sleeping in the crust, the slow planetary tremor that sounded like a deliberate rhythm, the carved slab locked under Antarctic ice, the recurring crescent and dot motif that haunted petroglyphs and declassified plates, into one extended field of possibility. If the evidence pointed toward a single, persistent influence, then one plausible reading was uncomfortable and precise. What had been observed might not merely be a record of humanity's rise, it might be a set of calibrated interventions whose traces had been left where the patient instruments of the present could eventually find them. To consider this hypothesis is to practice epistemic restraint while also embracing imaginative rigor. The mind must hold two things at once. First, that the accumulated dataset, cross-modal, cross-temporal, and statistically non-trivial, supports the idea of a recurring signature, an operator that imprinted itself on rock, metal, electromagnetic archives, and cultural grammar. Second, that inferring agency from pattern is perilous. Systems produce structure for many reasons: convergent evolution, rare geochemical coincidences, the metic drift, or the unanticipated consequences of climate, migration, and trade. Any claim of deliberate shaping must be measured against the burden of proof that such a hypothesis requires. What would such shaping look like? not as a mythology, but as a technical sequence. It can be usefully imagined across a spectrum of intervention strategies, each with different expectations and ethical implications. At one extreme, there is the subtle nudge, targeted seeding of information and topology that preferentially stabilizes certain cultural forms. Imagine motifs or mnemonic modules designed to persist across generations, placed in physical media that withstand erosion. A symbol embedded in rock art here, a pattern in craft there, so that cultural memory can be reconstituted even after political collapse. From an engineering point of view, this is plausible. Durable signals, distributed and redundant, are how long-term storage is achieved in every human archive. In the archaeological record, such nudges might appear as the recurrence of particular plant forms, iconographies, or astronomical alignments that persist beyond the reach of ordinary diffusion. A second mode is environmental steering, altering selective pressures in ways that bias trajectories without dictating outcomes. In ecology and evolutionary biology, researchers already create long-term experimental systems, islands, refugia, or controlled burns, to observe directional responses. An intelligence with planetary reach could, in principle, manipulate climates, introduce or remove keystone species, or adjust nutrient flows in microregions to favor certain adaptive routes. The geological anomalies and deep-time climate perturbations that are otherwise puzzling might, in such a frame, be read as levers used by an agent to coax particular developments. A third and more direct possibility is molecular intervention, the deliberate introduction of genetic or protogenetic polymers, the seeding of information for cognitive architectures that predispose populations to particular learning biases, or the targeted delivery of proto-technologies at moments of high leverage. The biochemical oddities recovered from the slab, polymers that do not align with terrestrial phylogenies, are precisely the sort of datum that would invite this line of inquiry. If such materials were indeed introduced, then the impulse of their introducers is ambiguous. Was it an uplift intended to enable certain cognitive capacities, a long-term experiment in cultural evolution, or something else entirely? Finally, there is the archival strategy, the deliberate embedding of multimodal records, metal lattices, phase-encoded signals, and symbolic anchors, designed to be legible only when a civilization's perceptual apparatus matures sufficiently. The crescent and dot motif, the phase-encoded metallic gratings, the buried slab under ice, the scattered archival echoes in mid-century radar logs, all could be components of a deliberate record system. In this view, the message decoded by the recent phased probe experiment was not a call for immediate conversation, but the activation of an archive whose keys were intentionally multiscalar and cross-domain. None of these models demand an intent that maps comfortably onto human categories like benevolence or malice. An experimenter might be indifferent, methodical, paternalistic, or perverse. It is possible, even likely, that motivations would appear alien. The technical posture of the hypothesis does not require teleology. It requires testable predictions. If the nudging model is correct, it should leave particular fingerprints, coordinated anomalies across independent physical regimes, isotopic fractionations in alloys that match signatures in extraterrestrial materials, phase coherent electromagnetic imprints across decades of instrumentation, genomic polymers with non-terrestrial codon biases that recur in sealed contexts, a statistical overrepresentation of mnemonic modules distributed in ways unlikely under diffusion, and engineered microstructures designed to respond to probing excitations. These are empirical claims that can be pursued without settling metaphysical verdicts. What shifts when this hypothesis gains credence is not only science, but ethics, law, and the architecture of meaning. That shift can be described in three overlapping registers: identity, responsibility, and governance. Identity. The narrative humans tell about themselves, origin stories, moral philosophies, historical teleologies, would necessarily pivot. For some, confirmation of intentional shaping would offer consolation, a cosmic lineage, a guardian, an explanation for sudden cognitive or cultural leaps. For others, it would produce a crisis of authorship, an undermining of the sense of human-earned achievement. But caution is necessary here. Histories of human dignity are not invalidated by discovery of external influence. Skill, judgment, suffering, and love are lived facts. Whether an external intelligence set initial conditions or nudged trajectories does not alter the phenomenology of everyday moral action. The cultural work will be to translate the discovery into meaning without collapsing human agency into a mere artifact of design. Responsibility. If humanity were an observed experiment, what obligations would follow, both backward and forward? Backward-looking culpability cannot be retroactively applied to those who acted before knowledge. Responsibility only accrues prospectively. There will be debates about reparations, recognition, and the proper framing of past achievements. More urgent is the forward question, whether to accept continued observation, to seek contact, or to assert autonomy. The moral calculus must weigh the value of knowledge against the risks of contact and the potential for further manipulation. An ethical minimum argues for deliberative global processes that include historically marginalized voices and that concede no unilateral claims to speak for humanity. Governance. The practical instruments of response will be surprisingly mundane: legal frameworks, scientific norms, cultural protocols, but their stakes will be immense. Who has the authority to obtain, interpret, and share data? What protections should be enacted for communities whose ancestral narratives may be implicated? How should potential biosafety questions be managed when dealing with non-terrestrial polymers? The answer lies in creating institutions modeled on precaution and inclusivity, international scientific consortia with transparent data sharing, polymath oversight committees that include ethicists and cultural representatives, and staged disclosure protocols that resist the theater of instant transparency while rejecting the secrecy that historically engenders distrust. There is a deeper normative question too. What does stewardship mean when the past itself might be curated by others? The discovery that an archive existed for the explicit purpose of preserving a planetary story imposes an obligation to preserve that archive without appropriation. That obligation has legal, practical, and symbolic dimensions. Practically, it means establishing custodial regimes that are international and locally participatory, protecting material from extraction and commodification. Symbolically, it demands humility, to treat the archive not as proof of human insignificance, but as an invitation to participate in a longer conversation about what it means to be a species with the ability to alter planetary systems. The psychological responses will be varied and powerful. There will be relief for some, fury for others, ecstatic wonder for many, and a kind of philosophical vertigo for philosophers. The social media age magnifies these emotions, accelerating polarizations and conspiracy narratives. That is why the procedural choices of scientists, institutions, and governments matter. Modeled after the hard-won lessons of dealing with hazardous pathogens and long-term climate policy, the emergent norms must balance openness with care, rapid peer review and replication, community consultation, staged public disclosure accompanied by explanatory context, and robust protections against the markets of sensationalism. There is a practical epistemic path forward. The summit of instruments that first collected whispers from the sky and the deep will have to reconfigure into a collaborative, hypothesis-driven campaign. The steps look familiar because science knows this choreography: quantify uncertainty, design discriminating tests, replicate independently, and publish methods and raw data, not only conclusions. Specifics would include controlled resequencing of anomalous polymers under multiple cleanroom conditions, targeted isotopic assays of metallic lattices with cross-lab intercomparisons, spatial statistical testing of motif recurrence corrected for sampling and preservation bias, and experiments that attempt to reproduce the recorded phase in coded archives in laboratory settings. Each positive result should be reproducible and independently verifiable. Each null result should refine priors, not produce headline-driven vacuums. A final virtue will be patience. Deep time is not an enemy, but a teacher. The archive that may have been placed for future discovery presumes temporality that outlasts empires and ideologies. Responding with speed without deliberation risks destroying the very contexts that make meaningful interpretation possible. To listen is to accept a tempo that matches the long durations that produced the evidence in the first place. This is not a call for paralysis. It is a call for measured action, for institutions to be humble, for public discourse to be informed rather than frivolous, and for science to be transparent without being performative. Whatever the eventual verdict, whether the nudging hypothesis proves robust, partially true, or false, the discovery will have already done something subtle and irreversible. It will have shifted the scale of inquiry outward and inward at once, outward to the architectures of distant intelligences and inward to the deep seams of human history and ethics. The more immediate lesson, and perhaps the most generative one, is ethical and epistemic rather than ontological. Humanity has been shown a mirror drawn by an agency capable of archiving across eons. The proper response is not to demand immediate answers from that otherness, but to cultivate the capacities, scientific, moral, and communal, to live in a world where such questions can be asked with care. In the hush that follows such a possibility, there is a human gesture that is small and necessary: a collective breath. To be told one might be a subject of an experiment is to be rendered suddenly plural, part participant, part artifact, and wholly responsible in the present. That multiplicity is not a diminishment. It is an occasion to remake the terms of stewardship, to bind curiosity to humility, and to learn how to listen across scales of time in a way that honors both the fragility and the dignity of life. If humanity is, in any sense, a project of another, then the moral task is clear: to respond as one would to any extended experiment in which one discovers oneself observed, with self respect, with inquiry, and with the hard patience that the archive has always required. What does it do to a planet when a single idea, that a persistent influence has threaded itself through rock, record, and culture, is suddenly no longer a hypothesis but a public problem? The politics of revelation unfolded like a map of fault lines. At the summit of instruments, the question of disclosure was never merely procedural, it was a civic fault, a choice that redistributed risk, meaning, and authority. The first fissure was bureaucratic. Some institutions argued for immediate transparency, holding that open data and rapid peer review were the moral default in an age of networked knowledge. Others counseled caution, warning that information itself could be destabilizing, that revelation could unsettle markets, inflame religious certainties, erode fragile alliances, and expose physical sites to pillage. Between these poles, a thousand derivative arguments proliferated about timing, framing, and the forms of public pedagogy necessary to avoid panic without paternalism. Governments, as institutions, polarized in ways that felt historically familiar yet oddly new. Some administrations, citing democratic norms and scientific openness, pushed for maximal disclosure: raw scans, spectrograms, and laboratory logs posted in public repositories with contextual notes. Their posture was that the facts, rigorously presented, would allow societies to process the discovery and institutionalize safeguards. Other authorities, citing national security, economic stability, and the potential for misuse, sought control, selective declassification, delayed release, and the invocation of precautionary principles. These competing impulses did not label themselves as good or bad so much as reflect different risk apportionments. What changed was the scale. The decisions would not affect a single electorate or a single economy, they would shape global knowledge ecologies. Religion, too, found itself reconfigured. Clerical bodies, scholars of faith, and informal spiritual networks read the emergent archive through very different hermeneutics. For some, the suggestion that the planet had been observed and perhaps influenced by an external intelligence confirmed long-standing theological narratives about stewardship and cosmic purpose. For others, the idea of an engineered archive or intentional nudge posed an epistemic challenge. If human flourishing was in part scaffolded by external intervention, what remained of doctrines that asserted human moral primacy? Faith communities wrestled with translation, how to integrate new evidence without becoming mere footnotes in a narrative written by another intelligence. The result was a cascade of internal debates, sermons that were at once cautious and incandescent, and a public rhetoric that tried to balance wonder with doctrinal continuity. Scholars and scientists were strained by a different axis of contestation. The project of knowledge creation, peer review, replication, disciplinary conservatism, met the political demand for narratives that comforted a fractious public. Some voices urged a slow, forensic posture: replicate, reproduce, stress, test every claim. Others feared that the time required for such rigor would cede the story to rumor and to actors whose motives were less restrained. In laboratories and on screens, the emotional texture was complicated: exhilaration at the prospect of startling, world-defining revelations, a guarded dread at the prospect of overreach, and a profound ethical unease about the consequences of mischaracterizing the evidence. The consensus that eventually formed was procedural rather than ontological. Science would do what science could do best: provide constraints, probabilities, and reproducible tests, while politics and culture would have to negotiate meaning beyond the lab. The public itself did not form a single chorus. Information ecologies were faulted by social media and fragmentary news cycles into factions: those who embraced the new evidence as liberating fact, those who dismissed it as elaborate hoax or misinterpretation, and those who feared the existential implications. In one register, the response was almost mundane: memes, merch, late-night riffs, but in other registers it was raw and consequential. Small towns with sites of discovery saw pilgrimages. Markets reacted to perceived risk and opportunity. Commodities tied to scientific infrastructure moved. Investment in research accelerators surged, and black markets for artifacts and leaked data swelled. Simultaneously, cultural memory banks, museums, oral history projects, indigenous councils, urged that any public reading of the finds respect custodial rights and living traditions. There was, across societies, an emotional oscillation between curiosity and anxiety, between the joy of new knowledge and the fear of becoming a subject in someone else's archival project. Secrecy and transparency entered a strange dance. Leaks and deliberate disclosures made information porous. The digital public square amplified partial truths into narratives whose energy sometimes outpaced verification. The ethics of release transformed into a technical problem with political vectors. How to publish data in forms that supported verification without providing exploitable trajectories for misuse. Legal scholars revised frameworks for ancient heritage and emerging biosecurity. Technologists proposed staged data access with verifiable cryptographic signatures, and international bodies contemplated norms for cross-border stewardship. The more the evidence looked like a topology of persistent influence, appearing in radar plates, in corroded lattices, in petroglyphs, and in ice, the more the world recognized that the question of whether to disclose was itself political material that would shape not only knowledge but power. Reluctance to settle on simple answers created new institutions. Multinational consortia convened with ethicists, physicists, conservators, and indigenous representatives. Protocols emerged that were not just scientific but ceremonial. Community-led consultations for any excavation, open archival platforms with layered access, and distribution policies that prioritized educational release over sensationalism. These were earnest attempts to bind method to moral imagination, to avoid repeating the colonial scripts of earlier centuries in which artifacts were extracted and stories written without consent. In public squares and prayer halls, the news did something slower and more interesting. It catalyzed conversation about time. The discoveries reframed what people meant by old and human. In living rooms and lecture halls, the tenor shifted from who discovered what to what time itself meant for responsibility. If artifacts and signals were intentionally designed to be legible across millennia, then the ethical horizon had to be stretched to match. Stewardship could no longer be measured in electoral cycles or patent terms. It required institutions that could steward questions across generations. Levers of trust were tested everywhere. The legitimacy of interpretive authorities declined in some quarters and rose in others. Museums and universities that committed to transparent, contextualized release of data gained public trust. Institutions that favored secrecy for control found their credibility eroded. The politics of memory and the politics of evidence interlocked, producing a new public civic literacy about uncertainty. Citizens demanded not a single narrative, but a fair accounting of competing probabilistic models. That demand, in itself, reshaped public discourse into a deliberative practice more patient and less performative than the viral cycles of earlier decades. And yet, beneath the institutional clamor, there was an important, quieter effect, a distributed collective of curiosity. Amateur archaeologists, radio amateurs, independent scientists, and community historians joined formal efforts as volunteers. They contributed field notes, scanned archives, and networked datasets. The summit of instruments became a larger ecology, not only telescopes and boreholes, but a social mesh that amplified disciplined curiosity and distributed verification. In that mesh lay both hope and hazard, democratization of discovery, and the danger that unvetted data might become fiction. The challenge of governance was not just to police truth, but to cultivate capacities for critical, patient listening at scale. Tracing the V. If the first political ripples asked who should know, the technical follow-up asked a different, more exacting question. How does one trace an influence that exists simultaneously as matter, motif, and modulation? The work that followed was forensic. In a new sense, it treated the entire planet as a layered archive and the problem as an exercise in cross-domain forensics. Tracing the VI shorthand that came into use for the project of tracking the influence's mechanisms and pathways required an unusual synthesis of methods. It combined isotope geochemistry, electromagnetic signal forensics, mimetic phylogenetics, network graph analysis, and biological sequencing under a single investigative rubric. The metaphor that guided teams was epidemiological. The VI was not necessarily a pathogen, but it behaved like one of ideas or patterns, diffusing through substrates both physical and social, leaving biomarkers that could be mapped. At the base of the inquiry was material fingerprinting. Metallic lattices were subjected to isotopic interrogation at resolution levels that had once been impossible. Chromium, tungsten, and nickel isotopes read to parts per million, trace impurities mapped with atom probe tomography, and microstructural quenching signatures decoded to infer cooling histories. The goal was to build provenance maps. If materials were manufactured, where did the ores come from? If thermal histories indicated engineered annealing, was there evidence of reheating phases consistent with deliberate fabrication? These results were cross-registered with geological databases to rule out plausible natural analogs. Electromagnetic traces required a different set of tools. Old radar plates and analog audio were digitized with lossless processes and analyzed for phase-coherent sidebands using time reversal techniques and modern deconvolution. Spectral patterns found in mid-century radar returns were compared to the narrowband carriers observed in modern sky surveys and to the phase relationships extracted from metallic lattices. The critical innovation was not any single instrument, but the practice of treating phase as an information-bearing quantity across media. Phase gradients in a metal, phase envelopes in a radar trace, and phase delays in a radio survey were all conceptually unified by algorithms that could normalize for medium-specific dispersion. When matches appeared, they did so as probabilities across domains, a confidence score that this electromagnetic signature correlated with that metallostructural phase pattern. Mimetic tracing, the study of motifs and their diffusion, required a behavioral toolkit. Symbols such as the crescent and dot were treated less as isolated images and more as carriers in a long-lived information economy. Graph analyses measured co-occurrence and positional regularities, while Bayesian chronological models assessed the probability that similar motifs in distant strata resulted from inheritance rather than convergence. Here, the analogy to phylogenetics was apt. Motifs were nodes on a tree that could split, recombine, or be lost. The statistical models did not yield mythic certainties. They produced priors that narrowed possibilities and suggested likely pathways for transmission, trade corridors, ritual exchanges, or shared archival practices. Perhaps the most sensitive branch of tracing involved the polymers recovered from the Antarctic slab. Their sequencing had already resisted conventional alignment. The follow-up required an expansion of the genetic toolbars. Instead of mapping them onto extant phylogenies, analysts built de novo information, theoretic models examining codon-like usage, periodicities, and error-correcting signatures. Were these polymers functional in ways commensurate with life? Or were they intentionally designed information media? The lab work was meticulous and conservative. Independent cleanroom replications, cross-platform sequencing, and blind interlaboratory comparisons. Biosafety protocols were stringent. The precautionary principle governed every pipette and primer. A central methodological innovation that emerged from these efforts was the idea of cross-modal correlation matrices, multidimensional maps that allowed investigators to test whether an isotopic anomaly, an electromagnetic phase, and a mimetic occurrence could plausibly be co-located in time and space. Correlations were never treated as proof, but as probabilistic vectors indicating where to invest the next tranche of effort. The matrix turned the project into an iterative search. Identify high probability corridors, instrument them with dense arrays, and test predictions with active experiments. Those active experiments took many forms. Phase-encoded probes were used to stimulate metallic microstructures. Phased radar time reversal. Pulses were fired into suspect lithologies to see whether coherent echoes could be elicited, and controlled cultural fieldwork. Respectful, community-led, tested whether interpretations of motifs fit living traditions or represented contaminants. Each experiment carried ethical obligations, minimized disruption to sites, secure consent for any intrusive action, and prioritize the presence and rights of those whose landscapes held the traces. Tracing the VI also revealed that the influence, if it was an influence at all, moved by multiple vectors. Some pathways were structural and slow, durable mnemonic modules etched into stone that endured climate and collapse. Others were material and medium-term metallic gratings that could carry phase information for millennia under certain geochemical conditions. Still others were informational and fast, symbolic forms that spread through trade and ritual as a kind of cultural meme. The search mapped a multi-layered topology rather than a single highway. As the technical campaign matured, an uncomfortable pattern emerged. The V, whatever its ontology, had intentional design features optimized for longevity and redundancy. Symbols were encoded into materials that resist weathering. Electromagnetic carriers were placed in narrow spectral windows that survived atmospheric scatter. Organic polymers had error, correcting motifs that rendered them resilient to hydrolytic decay. Whether that design was the product of a maker, an emergent system, or some other process, the practical implication was the same. The archive had been engineered to be findable. That implied foresight, and with foresight came ethical questions that the world had only begun to learn how to answer. Tracing the VI was not merely a technical enterprise, it became a moral practice. Laboratories instituted open protocols for chain of custody. Multinational bodies developed norms for staged release of sensitive sequences, and local communities were embedded in decision-making about fieldwork and display. The researcher's posture shifted from conqueror to custodian. Every new match required a conversation about stewardship. Who would hold the material? How would it be conserved? And who had the authority to interpret it? The social impact of the tracing campaign rippled outward. Some publics, seeing convergent evidence, adopted narratives of shared planetary memory. Others doubled down on skepticism. Conspiracy economies reconfigured themselves, selling speculative reconstructions and dubious fragments. That made the institutional commitment to patience and transparency all the more important. The trace evidence demanded rigorous replication and a humility that the market rarely rewards. In the quiet moments between experiments, the framing of the work returned to time. Tracing the V underscored an epistemic lesson. To interrogate deep records is to adopt a tempo that honors the durations those records were meant to cross. Quick verdicts would almost surely fail. The right answer was rarely an immediate revelation, and more often an accumulation. Bayesian, slow, and corrected for every bias the instruments introduced. The project required an architecture of governance as durable as the traces they sought. Legal instruments, scientific norms, and cultural protocols capable of spanning decades, perhaps centuries. Tracing the Vi did not end with a single path or a simple origin story. Instead, it produced an increasingly constrained map of possibilities and a growing repertoire of techniques. It taught that influence, whether intentional or emergent, left a fingerprint in many registers: isotopic grains, phase-coherent spectrums, resilient symbols, and layered polymeric memory. The method that would prevail was not brute force, but a kind of epistemic patience, not a rush to narrative, but the slow weaving together of independent threads. That weaving was itself an ethical act. To trace is also to name, to claim, and sometimes to appropriate. The teams that pursued the Vi came to accept a new professional creed. The burden of proof carried a parallel duty of care. Discovery was no longer only about knowledge. It was about custodianship of the past, and about the humility to admit how small human institutions are before depths of time. The traces compelled a posture of listening that was generous, patient, and accountable, an approach to evidence designed not to dominate the past, but to learn from it with respect. In the end, both the global reaction and the tracing of the Vi converged on a single, quiet insight. Discovery is a social act as well as a scientific one. The planet had, in layered ways, returned a set of traces that asked for more than analysis. They asked for responsibility. How the world chose to interpret, to preserve, and to live with those traces would shape not only the story people tell about their origins, but the institutions through which future generations would read the planet's long and patient archives. The necessary response was not sensational proclamation, but a steady, inclusive practice of listening, testing, and care. A civic science for a planet with memories older than any human polity and mysteries patient enough to demand time. What does a whisper look like when it arrives from a place that is not a place at all, when it slides across the boundary of a star's influence and becomes something a machine can touch? The question was simple enough to be clinical. A spectral fingerprint, narrow and persistent, had been catalogued in the outermost scans. It matched, unusually and insistently, the same phase-encoded signature that previous investigations had pulled from the planet's crust, from archival radar plates, from corroded lattices, and from inscriptions preserved under ice. This was not coincidence. It was an echo that folded across scales. Telescopes registered the signal first, not as drama, but as data. Wide-field radio arrays, spaceborne interferometers, and optical observatories, in tight coordination, triangulated a source just beyond the heliopause, a faint carrier with a complex sideband structure, a modulated envelope whose harmonic ratios chimed with those found in other anomalies. The emission did not look like any natural astrophysical process catalogued in the databases. It occupied narrow spectral windows often overlooked by surveys aimed at thermal continua. It threaded phase information across bands in a way that betrayed intentionality if one believed that pattern and purpose could be measured empirically. The response was procedural and global. Again, the world turned its instruments outward with a choreography honed by years of listening. Arrays phased up to synthesize apertures the size of continents. Cryogenic receivers cooled to whispering temperatures. Quantum samplers recalculated priors. The result was a fog of probabilities narrowing, a convergence in which the signal's contours rose from statistical background into something that provoked a decision. Send a probe. That decision was not a captain's order. It was a modular orchestration of engineering constraints, legal frameworks, and ethical commitments. The probe itself was less a singular hero spacecraft than a distributed apparatus, an interplanetary messenger composed of instruments modeled to be both sensitive and minimal. A lattice of phased antennas, a suite of non-destructive spectrometers, nanoscale probes capable of phased excitation, and an adaptive cognition trained to act with calibrated restraint. Its trajectory was conservative, designed to minimize perturbation. Its instruments were tuned not to pry, but to read. Transit was long and deliberate, measured in months of coast, in gravity assists, in the slow patience of ion thrust arcs. Global attention did not concentrate on a single control room so much as diffuse into an economy of anticipation. News cycles conserved their breath. Museums and cultural institutions prepared contextual briefings. International consortia drafted stewardship agreements that prioritized restraint, indigenous consultation, and open data protocols. The mission became a civic act. The planet's sensors had found something beyond their borders, and the reply would be collective. Approach began as math. As the probe closed, simple photometry gave way to structured probing. Synthetic apertures imaged the object at progressively finer scales. Active radar pulses, time-reversed and phase-matched, were sent in cautious bursts. Each ping returned a complex reverberation, echoes with deliberate phase offsets, diffractive patterns that implied apertures, not amorphous surfaces. The object, at first a point of interest in a sparse field, revealed edges. The edges were regular. The geometry resisted a natural template. Planes appeared where random erosion might have produced only noise. Regular perforations patterned one face as if an armature had been laid into metal and then encrusted by space. Surface roughness bore microtopographies consistent with manufacturing processes rather than thermal fracture. Spectrometers read back an alloying signature that echoed the odd isotopic anomalies once detected in the buried lattice, ratios of trace elements that did not quite match terrestrial baselines. Axioms formed in instrument arrays, isotopic oddity plus geometric regularity plus phase-encoded resonance was a set of constraints that pushed the posterior probability toward artificiality. The probe's nanoscale probes, originally designed to sample fine dust, were repurposed into excitation arrays. They sent controlled, minute perturbations across the object's surfaces, stimulating phonon modes and electronic resonances. The object answered, not with language, with form. Phase states across its microstructure shifted in coherent ways. A three-dimensional phase field unfurled in the probe's sensors, a volumetric waveform whose modulation held structure at multiple scales. When the data were transformed and rendered, they produced a mapped topology that was neither purely geometric nor purely electromagnetic. It was an operating archive. That archive spoke in modalities the earlier work had come to expect. The phase field carried motifs that matched the crescent and dot pattern cataloged in petroglyphs and in the incised slab dug from the ice. Those motifs were not mere decoration, they functioned as operators. Under particular phase excitations, they resolved into compositional gradients and into nested holographic sequences of imagery. The unveiling was iterative. Each probe excitation peeled another layer of the archive's grammar. With careful calibration and countless cycles of stimulation and listening, the probe reconstructed a slow reel of data, images, phase maps, and temporal sequences that read like an external chronicle of a planetary system and of inhabitants that had once altered light and stone. The discovery was not sudden cinematic revelation. It was a dense, procedural unspooling. The reconstructed imagery showed an orbiting body with a familiar star, a planetary disk with coastlines, seasonal shifts, energy signatures that looked unmistakably technological at moments of high resolution, patterns of nocturnal illumination, orbital craft as reflected pinpricks, linear transects across landscapes that suggested organized infrastructure. Interleaved were close-ups of morphological schematics, functional rather than representational, documenting limbs, tools, craft, and the accretion of material culture. These sequences mirrored reads from earlier finds, metallic lattices, phase-encoded gratings, polymeric patterns in sealed inclusions. What the archive did not contain was invitation. There were no messages of greeting, no plea, no command. It behaved more like a curated museum, a watchman's ledger, an inventory catalog. If the object had ever been active as a beacon, its present state was archival, a preservation of data deployed across media and designed to be legible to agents capable of transducing phase and matter simultaneously. The engineer's language fit, redundant encoding, error-correcting motifs, multimodal carriers tuned to survive dispersive environments. The technology was old, but its design principle, longevity through redundancy and cross-domain encoding, was unmistakable. The implications were immediate and complex. Material analyses linked surface chemistry to isotopic excursions similar to those measured in crustal lattices. The same narrow spectral band that had first drawn attention in the outer system resonated in the phase-encoded volumetry. Polymers detected in protected cavities exhibited base-like sequences that, like the Antarctic inclusion, failed to align with terrestrial phylogenetic trees. Nothing in the data demanded a final metaphysical verdict, yet the convergence of independent anomalies across media and distance formed a dense lattice of inference. The probability of a single, persistent influence that had deployed archival systems across space and time moved from speculative hypothesis toward working model. The global response was a test of institutions. Information was managed with a new code of careful release, datasets accompanied by methods, uncertainties, and community consultations. Disclosure protocols that had been practiced in laboratories regarding subtle finds, staged, contextualized, and accompanied by stewardship commitments, were applied on planetary scales. Conferences convened not to sensationalize but to establish procedures. Heritage councils insisted on the inclusion of indigenous perspectives wherever geographic linkages emerged, arguing that interpretation of traces must be accountable to the living cultures that steward landscapes and histories. Ethicists, analysts, and scientists rehearsed a familiar caveat: discovery is not interpretation. Instruments extend perception, institutions commit meaning. The archive's presence at the edge of the system posed questions that were moral as much as scientific. Had the influence deliberately seeded records and materials to nudge developing species across epochs? If so, with what intention? Conservationist prudence insisted on caution in assigning teleology. Yet the encounter forced a reorientation. The planet's earlier evidence, crustal lattices, subterranean resonances, carved slabs, and archival echoes, now fit more comfortably into a model of long-term external preservation. Whether that preservation was paternal, experimental, or indifferent remained open. The probe continued its work. It did what it had been designed to do: sample, stimulate, record, and withdraw with minimal perturbation. Onboard cognition prioritized redundancy, multiple independent measurement modalities, cross-platform verification, and conservative thresholds for declaring novel biochemistry or intentionality. Data were transmitted in batches back across the interplanetary link. Each parcel of information fed the summit of instruments, where quantum samplers reweighted priors and machine ensembles proposed new, discriminating observations for subsequent passes. There was an unavoidable human effect, collective and diffuse, that instruments could not compute. The encounter rearranged common narratives about place and time. The public imagination oscillated between exhilaration and disquiet. Some interpreted the archive as confirmation that the planet had long been a node in an interstellar network of recorders. Others feared the prospect of being the subject of design. Religious and philosophical discourse deepened, not toward dogma, but into questions about authorship, responsibility, and the ethics of awakening. Markets reflected uncertainty through investment in research and in protective measures. Cultural institutions wrestled with whether to display renderings and how to do so without appropriating contexts or igniting predatory interests. Amid the noise, a narrower, steadier conversation held. What does contact mean when contact is archival? The nuance mattered. A beacon that signals for interaction and a record intended for later reading are different acts. One seeks dialogue, the other seeks preservation. The archive at the system's edge behaved like the latter. If an intelligence had valued non-interference, it might have left records rather than interventions. If it had hoped to nudge, it might have done so through carefully calibrated signals or material seeding. The probe's findings could support both possibilities in part without forcing either into certification. The ethical dimension extended beyond intent into stewardship. The artifact at the heliopause was, in practical terms, material heritage outside national jurisdictions, but within a system of shared interest. It required custodial frameworks, robust enough to handle not only conservation, but the interpretation of consequences. What if further probing revealed bioactive polymers whose release could impact extant biospheres? What if reconstructive renditions of the archive catalyzed political instability or cultural appropriation? These were not hypothetical footnotes. They were operational realities demanding legal and moral instruments as intricate as the technology that had found the archive. In the formal language of science, the event was a Bayesian update. The prior distribution for a persistent, cross-domain influence shifted, so did the confidence intervals around mechanisms of transmission. In the practical language of governance, it was a call to build institutions whose tempos matched those encoded in the finds: patient, transnational, and inclusive. In the effective language of communities, it was an instantiation of wonder laced with the sober recognition of smallness, small before deep time, small before the engineering of durability. The probe's approach had been an act of listening that moved beyond the planet's edge and returned with a reply. Not a personified emissary, but an archive that had waited in the cold. The relay of images, phase fields, and material assays knitted together threads that had once been distributed and obscure. Contact, in this sense, was not contact with a conscious agent in the communicative sense, but contact with an intention encoded in matter and timing. It was a hands-off conversation across epochs, an invitation to comprehension rather than to immediate correspondence. As the probe began the long arc of withdrawal, its instruments full of raw, hesitant knowledge, the global posture shifted towards stewardship. Committees charted transparent protocols for analysis and for public engagement. Laboratories replicated assays in multiple cleanrooms. Cultural stewards petitioned for rights to co-curate renderings and to contextualize findings in ways that respected living traditions. The summit of instruments, now expanded to include legal and ethical machinery, learned a new lesson about the duty that comes with perception: to interpret with humility, to publish with care, and to govern the appetite for disclosure responsibly. The final image, for the moment the most resonant, was a simple one: a probe receding into the thin light beyond the star, its antennae still humming, its data packets drifting like a slow rain toward a pale planet. It carried back more than numbers. It carried a shifted horizon in which the idea that what one hears changes what one is obliged to become. Contact, in its archival form, had altered the scale of human listening. The planet that had once only sent probes outward had now been answered by a presence encoded in the cold. The reply was not a solution, but a summons to build institutions patient enough for deep time and to learn to respond with the restraint that long-lived archives deserve. What is the last question a civilization can ask when it finally understands the shape of its being in the long ledger of the planet? The query arrived not as a single revelation, but as the accumulated weight of evidence, a lattice of observations across mediums and timescales that no longer permitted comfortable ignorance. The archive at the system's edge, the phase-encoded carrier threading radio telescopes and crustal sensors, the metallic lattice nested in rock, the carved slab sealed beneath ancient ice, the crescent and dot motif repeated in scratched stone, in witness sketches, and in microscopic grain patterns, the declassified plates and reels that, when digitized and cross-correlated, hummed with the same harmonic signature. Together they composed a chorus that could be read in only one way. Something had been keeping record. Something had been designing for endurance. Something had been, in some measure, attentive. What humanity now knew was modest in one register and enormous in another. Modest because none of the findings offered a neat explanatory chain. Enormous because the convergence of independent anomalies across materials, archives, and wavelengths forced a reassessment of scale. The evidence did not yet demand a single causal origin, but it did demand a new posture toward the past and future. An influence. Call it a topology, a mechanism, or, in shorthand used in technical briefs, the VE had left fingerprints that spanned stars and stone. The final question, folded into that realization, was not merely epistemological. It was ethical, civic, and temporal. What would humans do now that they knew the world had been watched, recorded, and perhaps nudged? To approach that question required an architecture of scenes, each thick with procedural care and human feeling. Laboratories filled the middle hours of the night with the same low chorus, cryocoolers ticking, the soft click of servos, arrays of monitors painting pale faces in blue. Clean room teams repeated sterile gestures with fatigue and devotion, scan after scan, blind replication after blind replication, the same anomalous polymers, the same phase-coherent patterns, the same isotopic quirks reappeared. In parallel, councils convened in formal rooms whose carpets and conference tables framed debates that moved slowly from technical assessment to policy implication. Those rooms were inhabited by committees that walked a tightrope: the impulse to publish and the duty to preserve, the democratic instinct toward open data and the pragmatic anxieties about destabilizing misinformation. Behind each presentation, the same emotional rubric threaded through conversations: a restraint born of sobriety, an undercurrent of wonder, a measured fear of what disclosure would unfasten. Public life reacted in the ways unprecedented data often do. Social feeds muttered, then roared. Public gatherings formed around museum facades and town halls where renderings of the projected archive, the slow reel of planetary changes, the schematic frames of anatomy and infrastructure, were displayed with captions that emphasized uncertainty. Religions refined sermons and statements, some framing the evidence as confirmation of attentive providence, others wrestling with the unsettling possibility of external design. Economies responded with a familiar mixture of speculative frenzy and risk aversion. Investors suddenly valued instrumentation and stewardship as assets. At the grassroots, communities with living ties to the landscapes implicated by the finds demanded inclusion, counsel, and respect. The discovery did not fall like a single bolt. It diffused. And in its diffusion, it reshaped how people argued about ownership of the past and responsibility for the future. The technical story was precisely the kind that documentary apparatuses prize, incremental, cumulative, and governed by method. Isotopic fingerprints in alloys were read like cartographies of provenance. Phase-coherent sidebands in analog radar plates were compared against modern radio arrays in careful statistical frameworks. Lattice microstructures were driven with phased excitations to reveal nested phase fields that, when rendered, read like image sequences. Each dataset carried its own uncertainty envelope. The collective analysis was, in effect, an exercise in Bayesian patience. The probability landscape tilted enough to make certain hypotheses reasonable, that an external apparatus had engineered redundancy into records at multiple physical scales, that a set of motifs had been seeded as mnemonic anchors, and that at least some of the anomalous polymers represented preserved information media not homologous to known terrestrial biochemistry. Yet the presence of inference is not the same as evidence of intent. That distinction remained critical in every meeting. The rhetorical impulse to name agency prematurely was resisted not out of prudence alone, but because naming agency carried immediate moral consequences. To assume a benevolent designer would incline policy toward engagement. To assume an indifferent experimenter would incline it toward autonomy and defense. The institutions that steward knowledge, academies, museums, international consortia, reoriented themselves so that the act of interpretation would be collective, multidisciplinary, and, as repeatedly emphasized by ethicists, inclusive of voices historically sidelined in the curatorial project of human history. The practical options came into focus as a taxonomy of responses. One path favored active outreach, construct a carefully calibrated signal, a reply designed to demonstrate scientific transparency and a wish for dialogue. Another argued for silence, to refrain from broadcasting until more was known, to limit interpretation, and to avoid providing a signal that might be misused. A third refused either-or thinking and proposed stewardship, protect the traces, decentralize access, build institutions that preserve and contextualize without exploiting. Each option had moral vectors that could not be reduced to technical feasibility alone. To reply risked unknown consequences. To remain silent risked abdication from a moral responsibility to respond to the evidence of attention, if attention implied duty. To steward required infrastructural patience and global cooperation that the international community had rarely sustained at scale. Those debates were not abstract. They reorganized how research missions were designed. The probe at the heliopause became a case study in restraint. Mission architectures emphasized non-destructiveness, redundancy of measurement, and distributed data release protocols. Fieldwork in regions with discovered traces adopted community-first frameworks. Local stewardship councils proposed moratoria until agreements could be reached, and archaeometric teams published methods and raw data rather than interpretive press releases. Legal scholars drafted treaties to handle cross-border artifacts, and biosafety boards wondered, with grave care, about the handling of polymeric sequences whose informational structure did not map to known phylogenies. Scientific forums rehearsed scenarios in which laboratory release of sequences could be problematic, not because of immediate pathogenicity, but because of unknown ecological interactions and the potential for irresponsible exploitation. The margin between curiosity and harm had become a policy domain. Beyond institutions, something more subtle took place in the cultural fabric. Artists, poets, filmmakers, and teachers found themselves working with new metaphors and new anxieties. The archive's silent chronicle, an external gaze that recorded rise and fall, energy signatures and coastal erasures, reframed narratives about stewardship. Education curricula incorporated long-term thinking as central content. How to read phases and grains became a way of teaching civic patience. Museums reframed exhibits to foreground process and uncertainty. Displays emphasized method, provenance, and the ethics of interpretation over sensational labels. In towns touched by fieldwork, local oral histories were documented and placed at the center of interpretation, signaling a small but significant reversal of the colonial practice in which the living were silenced by displays of the past. The moral dimensions widened into longer-term design challenges. If the VI had engineered records for longevity, then the technology and ethic of record keeping mattered more than ever. The discourse shifted from who did this to how do humans ourselves make records that are not predatory. If a set of motifs and materials could survive millennia and shape future cognition, those same techniques could be used by human hands to create archives that honored posterity. Architects and engineers began sketching communal long-term repositories, archives built not for spectacle but for resilience, designed to be maintainable across cultural and political transitions. Legal theorists expanded the notion of rights temporally, advocating for the rights of future persons and for obligations extending in timescales far beyond election cycles. At the heart of the matter lay a question of agency and authorship. Why would an intelligence, if intelligence was the right word, go to such lengths to record a planet? The decoded archive offered no emotional pleadings, no moral injunctions. It behaved like an inventory, cataloging planets, populations, material cultures, energy flows, and change. The rendering, when finally read by cross-modal decoders, had been a neutral chronicle rather than a manifesto. That neutrality itself became a clue. If the maker's ethic was preservation over intervention, then the act respected autonomy while still claiming a moral position that some phenomena were worth preserving even when direct interference would violate the organic unfolding of cultures. The final question became sharper. What kind of reply did humanity want to be capable of making? The question invited multiple nested answers. On the epistemic plane, it demanded rigor. Replicate, verify, and reconstruct only to the extent that protocols allowed. On the civic plane, it demanded inclusion, the right of local communities and of global publics to shape interpretive frameworks. On the moral plane, it demanded humility, acknowledged the contingency of human knowledge, the partiality of any narrative, and the ethical cost of hubris. On the temporal plane, it demanded institutions capable of custody for centuries, not ephemeral commissions, but guilds of stewardship with binding commitments to preservation, consent, and distributed governance. There was also a quieter, metaphysical implication that the public conversation could not evade. The recognition that an archive existed across planets and stone reframed the human sense of scale. The narrative of exceptionalism, of being solitary and center stage in the cosmos, softened. That did not erase human value. Instead, it reframed human responsibility. If being observed by an archive imposes no direct obligation, the knowledge that one is recorded still imposes a moral question. How does a species behave when it knows that its actions will be legible to distant watchers and to its own descendants? The answer, when stated plainly, came down to stewardship of environment, culture, knowledge systems, and of the fragile capacities that enable moral imagination. Awareness itself demanded careful action. The world began to articulate a set of pragmatic norms that, together, amounted to an ethical program. First, transparency bounded by deliberative procedure. Publish methods and raw data with caveats and provenance, while sequencing and handling of anomalous polymers obey strict biosafety audits. Second, custodial congregations. International consortia of scientists, indigenous elders, ethicists, and legal scholars charged with stewardship rather than with appropriation. Third, long-term record-making. Investment in durable archives that are designed for repairability, distributive access, and cultural consent. Fourth, restraint in outreach. Protocols for when and how to reply, emphasizing multilateralism and a global participatory decision-making process over unilateral broadcasts. Even as institutions formalized policies, the human emotional landscape remained textured. There were moments of sorrow for the fragments of past cultures that perhaps would never be known. There were bursts of joy as methods revealed a new layer of planetary history. There was also a collective humility, the softening of certainty that once propped up grand narratives. Perhaps the most pervasive affect, across laboratories, council rooms, and kitchen tables, was a renewed curiosity threaded with responsibility. The archive's mute chronicling had not demanded obedience, it had invited attention. To listen was to inherit a task. In the end, the final question resolved into a choice of posture as much as into a policy prescription. Knowing that an influence had threaded itself through rock, record, and culture, humanity could claim one of several moral stances: to react with fear, to respond with conquest, to commodify the past, or to accept the responsibility of stewardship. The archival encounter favored the last. It called for patient governance, for expansive empathy across timescales, and for the remaking of institutions to protect not only artifacts, but the dignity of communities and the integrity of the planet's longer narratives. The narrative closed, for now, on a small image rather than a proclamation. In dim control rooms and in village halls, in labs and in courtrooms, people set down procedures and rehearsed humility. They codified restraint, they built custodial councils, they rewrote curriculum to teach long-term thinking, they designed archives meant to survive political weather and cultural storms. The question was not resolved in a single act, but committed to practice, how to live when the past is recorded and when the record itself demands care. That is the final question, stretched across the world's short attention spans and long epics. Having been read by another, what will humans choose to write back? Into their own deeds, into their stewardship of the planet, and into the long ledger where future eyes may find them? The answer would not be instantaneous. It would be measured in policies, in memorials, in repaired landscapes, in education, and in the daily ethics of communities. It would be written slowly, in the patient ink of institutions shaped to honor time, and in the quieter acts of individuals who choose, day by day, the form their species' legacy will take. What does a civilization become when it finally understands someone, or something, has been keeping its records, shaping its echoes, and perhaps nudging its path? The question arrived not as a single revelation, but as the gravitational pull of all the previous findings. The vast lattice of correlations, the metallic arrays sleeping in fractured crusts, the patient tremor whose harmonics threaded seismometers and magnetometers, the carved slab entombed under Antarctic ice, the crescent andot recurring in rock and reel, the archival ghosts of mid-century radar and tape. Together, they formed an argument that could no longer be politely bracketed as anomaly. The planet had been read. Whether that reading had been disinterested cataloging, experimental intervention, or some mixture in between remained unresolved. The practical and ethical question pressed forward like a tide. Could a species that discovers it has been observed and perhaps influenced continue to assert itself as an independent civilization? Or would it be destined to remain the subject of experiments whose parameters it could never fully control? The initial public reaction to that question was predictable in its variety and consequential in its intensity. Institutions obliged with process, peer review meetings, international committees, staged releases of method and metadata. Governments argued about timing, diplomats about framing, and heritage bodies about consent. But beneath procedural debate, there was a deeper social psychology at work. Populations experienced an existential reorientation, a mixture of fascination, betrayal, relief, and vertigo, and out of that mixture came two urgent demands that would govern the next decades. First, the demand to know as much as possible. Second, the demand to preserve as much as possible. Those imperatives were aligned but not identical. Knowledge sought speed, replication, and publication. Preservation insisted on restraint, guardianship, and time-scaled stewardship. The task of modern civilization became, for the moment, to hold those imperatives together. Holding them together required institutional invention and cultural recalibration. The summit of instruments, which until then had been a technical consortium coordinating telescopes, probe teams, and subterranean arrays, broadened into a civic apparatus. New bodies were established, less to decide what the facts meant, and to regulate how the facts would be handled. Custodial councils composed of scientists, ethicists, legal scholars, representatives from affected communities, and delegates from international organizations. Audit protocols for sensitive datasets that combined open science principles with staged access. Biosafety frameworks for handling anomalous polymers that extended beyond current laboratory norms, and an emergent charter for long-term stewardship emphasizing repairability, decentralization, and cultural consent. Those structures did not resolve the metaphysical question of agency, but they began to shape the operative question of autonomy. Who governs the knowledge, and by what principles? There are two broad strategies a civilization can pursue when confronted by stronger or older intelligence: integration and insulation. Integration means learning to engage, to understand the archives, to interpret possible intentions, and to develop protocols for measured reciprocity. Insulation emphasizes independence, building systems, norms, and safeguards that minimize vulnerability to external manipulation. Both strategies are costly, and both are incomplete. Neither guarantees safety nor absolves responsibility. They are, however, complementary. The choice before any polity and before the global commons is not binary but architectural. How to design institutions, technologies, and cultural practices that allow for careful contact if warranted, while preserving the capacity for self-determination. On the technological front, the imperative for independence pushed a set of concrete measures. First, sensor sovereignty, distributed interoperable networks of environmental, orbital, and subsurface sensors under diverse governance models reduce systemic vulnerability. When observation is pluralized, when no single nation or company controls the full seam of data, manipulation becomes harder and accountability easier. Second, provenance and cryptographic integrity for all collected records. A rigorous chain of custody and signed raw data ensure that artifacts, scans, and sequences cannot be clandestinely altered. Third, redundancy in analytical pipelines. Independent labs with different instruments, different clean and room standards, and different analytical approaches are essential to avoid monoculture thinking and to reduce the risk that a single compromised method yields a global misinterpretation. Fourth, containment and biosecurity protocols expanded to cover novel polymers or informational chemistries, a precautionary regime for unknown materials that treats absence of evidence of harm as insufficient reason for careless handling. Institutional design was no less material. The emergent governance architecture favored polycentricity, overlapping jurisdictions with mandated transparency, dispute resolution mechanisms that respected indigenous and local claims, and a requirement that any intrusive testing or excavation be governed by joint stewardship agreements. The logic was simple. If external agency had past access to nudge or to archive, it was ethically urgent that no single actor in the present be able to hijack the planet's memory for narrow ends. Shared custodianship could not guarantee that every decision would be wise, but it diluted the risk of unilateral experiments, illicit commercialization, or appropriation. Legal frameworks followed. The old territorial logics of heritage law proved too narrow for archives that dissolved across media and epics. New treaties and domestic statutes began to conceptualize planetary heritage as a category that superseded purely national claims when traces intersected global commons, deep ocean floors, polar ice, or orbital spaces. Those instruments emphasized stewardship duties, not ownership. They recognized obligations to future persons and the need to defer immediate exploitation in favor of patient, multi-generational custodianship. They also embedded precautionary principles into any decision involving materials or data whose consequences lay outside current epistemic control. Culture, however, proved to be the most delicate part of the work. Knowledge that one has been observed alters narratives of agency, authorship, and moral worth. The dominant story of human exceptionalism. Progress from wilderness to mastery, from chance to design, needed reframing. That reframing is neither nihilistic nor celebratory. It is a call to humility without surrender. To live as a civilization with dignity under the knowledge of possible outside observation is to double down on the everyday moral work that defines agency. The creation of institutions that allow justice, empathy, and self-governance to persist, the cultivation of arts and stories that integrate new facts into communal meaning without erasing human experience, and the reaffirmation that even if initial conditions were influenced, human choices, love, craft, and moral responsibility remain real in their consequences. Practically, cultural adaptation took many forms. Curricula reoriented to teach long-time scales and repairable knowledge, museums restructured exhibits to foreground process, provenance, and the ethical story of discovery. Community parliaments and local stewardship boards were resourced to co-manage nearby sites, and public media models prioritized sober, contextualized explanations over spectacle. These are small acts with heavy moral density, a classroom that teaches how to read phases and grains, a village council empowered to veto intrusive digs, a library whose archival practice is distributed among remote communities. Together, they make a civilization robust not only in technology but in habit. Yet the fear remained plausible that any archival engagement might merely be the opening chapter in a longer experiment whose designers returned in cycles. That fear had to be taken seriously because it shaped behavior from defensive technological choices to legislative prudence. The answer could not be mere paranoia. It had to be an epistemic program. That program emphasized repeatability over rumor, method over myth, and scenario planning over panic. It asked not whether humanity could escape being studied sometimes, but whether it could institutionalize consent and reciprocity in the face of influence. Consent, after all, is the only seeming safeguard against being treated purely as subject rather than agent. What would consent look like at cosmic scales? The civilization pursued a staged protocol. The first stage was verification, multiple independent confirmatory experiments, and transparent publication of raw data and methods. The second was deliberation. Multinational assemblies and representative bodies convened with advisory time horizons measured in generations, not election cycles. The third was thresholded action. Any unilateral communicative act, a deliberate broadcast, a material alteration of a site, or a biological release required supermajority decisions across custodial bodies and affirmative consent from affected communities. These thresholds would slow impulsive responses and provide time for ethical and technical testing. They would not, of course, prevent all harm, but they would create friction against arbitrary manipulation and make the costs of experimentation visible and collective. There was also a countervailing moral case for measured engagement. If an external intelligence had invested resources to archive a planet precisely so its history could be legible, might a reciprocal gesture, careful communication, where warranted, be ethically permissible? The civilization debated this as a practical ethics problem. Many argued that if contact were meaningful, it should be pursued only when multiple safeguards guaranteed that any reply would not be used to manipulate or instrumentally remake human societies. Others insisted that silence might itself be a moral abdication when knowledge could prevent harm. The resolution was procedural. No single actor would decide. Deliberative institutions would frame the question and present options reflecting scientific uncertainty, ethical plurality, and the probable irreversibility of major actions. Beyond governance, there was a necessary psychological and philosophical work. Societal resilience demanded narrative practices that could hold complexity, histories that admit externality without erasing agency, rituals that reassert community ownership of meaning, and arts that make room for wonder without succumbing to fatalism. Intellectual humility became an ethic rather than a pose, the routine of acknowledging uncertainty in public addresses, the norm of deferring to distributed expertise while foregrounding local voices, and the practice of cultivating patience as civic capital. Such cultural dispositions are not easily legislated. They are inculcated through education, through media practices that model careful reasoning, and through the slow commerce of civic life. Finally, there is a technological horizon that must be acknowledged. Independence in an age of potential external influence is partly engineering. Resilient infrastructures, decentralized knowledge ecologies and materials, science that prioritize reparability and reversibility. It is partly epistemic, open, replicable methods, and cryptographic provenance that prevent a single actor from defining truth. It is also legal and normative, treaties, stewardship charters, and ethical codes that bind decision-making across generations. The convergence of these domains, engineering, epistemics, governance, and culture, forms the scaffolding of a civilization that aspires to be independent in will, even while accepting that it may have been subject to influences in the past. The larger, unresolvable philosophical question persists. If a civilization grows up with the awareness that its developmental arc may have been nudged, does that diminish the moral worth of its choices? The practical answer the new institutions adopted was simple and humane. Intentionality, origin, or prior influence does not negate lived experience. Achievements, failures, love, suffering, these retain moral force. What changes is the frame through which such acts are understood. With that new frame comes responsibility, to care for the planet and its archives, to preserve the dignity of communities, to approach contact, if it ever becomes a real possibility, with humility and consent, and to build institutions that measure their decisions not only by short-term gain, but by the capacity to steward knowledge across generations. In the end, the civilization's last great question reframed itself from, "Are we alone?" into "How will we be together, with each other, with our pasts, and with whatever watchers there may be?" The answer was not tidy. It was procedural, polycentric, and deliberately slow. It required the patient craft of law, the serendipity of art, the rigor of science, and the stubbornness of ordinary civic life. Those were the tools that allowed a people to assert agency in a universe whose archives might include more than their own handiwork. Whether humanity would become once more the subject of an experiment depended on choices as much as on external actors. The capacity to be manipulated exists in any asymmetry of power and information. The only durable mitigation is institutions that distribute authority, enforce transparency, and embed precaution as a social norm. Autonomy under observation is not absolute escape. It is a project of governance that treats knowledge, not as a trophy to be seized, but as a responsibility to be stewarded. So the civilization learned to ask different questions and to answer them in public and procedural ways. It institutionalized restraint and codified consent. It invested in distributed sensing and cryptographic provenance. It reimagined museums as civic forums and classrooms as laboratories for endurance. It recognized that being read by an other did not erase the ethical demands of living together. And it accepted that the most important act of independence would not be to deny that one was looked at, but to commit, openly and collectively. to the slow, careful work of choosing what to preserve, what to reveal, and how to remain a civilization that writes its own next lines even as it inhabits a ledger kept by forces older and stranger than any single polity. The question of whether humanity would be alone in the ethical sense remained unresolved. The practical question, whether it could continue to be autonomous rather than mere subject, had a clearer answer. Autonomy is not a static attribute to be recovered, but an ongoing practice to be negotiated. The work of that practice would be long, contested, and profoundly human. It would require institutions willing to slow the pulse of immediate curiosity and to bind the thrill of discovery to the steadiness of care. The last scene was not cinematic. It was a small, repeated gesture, committees meeting to finalize custodial charters, classrooms teaching timescales measured in millennia, small research teams replicating assays under blinding conditions, community councils deciding, with no external imperative, whether a nearby site should be sampled or left undisturbed. Those gestures, patient, procedural, and profoundly ordinary, were the civilization's answer. They did not promise the end of experiments, external or internal. They did promise, in the only sense that mattered, that the civilization would not surrender its authorship. It would keep writing its story, slowly, responsibly, and with a humility shaped by the knowledge that somewhere in the archive of the cosmos, it had been read,